Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. I was 13 years old when everything changed. My grandmother had been fighting cancer for months, and my mother and I had moved in with her to take care of her in her final days. We set up camp in the guest bedroom, the only room in the house that was large enough for both of us to sleep in. It was a cramped little space, but it would do. My grandmother's room was just down the hallway, right next to the bathroom. We'd taken shifts for weeks, making sure she had everything she needed and monitoring her health. But nothing could truly prepare us for what came next. The night I'm talking about, it was one of those nights that felt like the world had come to a standstill. The only sounds in the house were the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creaks of the old wooden floors as the house settled. My mother had always been the first to fall asleep, and I followed her shortly after, exhausted from the routine of watching my grandmother slip away piece by piece each day. Around 3 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't a jolt from a nightmare, but just the kind of wakefulness that sometimes came with the heavy quiet of the night. I looked over at my mother, who was still asleep, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. The moonlight shone through the small window above our bed, casting soft shadows across the room. I rolled over and closed my eyes, trying to will myself back to sleep, but something was off. I couldn't quite place it, but something felt wrong. Then, suddenly, the door to our room creaked open. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was just loud enough to pull me out of the half-daze I was in. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, when I saw my mother bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide, looking straight at the door. I froze. My body felt heavy, and the weight of the moment seemed to stretch on forever. A feeling of dread crept over me, slowly taking over every inch of my senses. "Mom," I whispered. She didn't answer, but her eyes were still fixed on the door. Then, from the darkened hallway, I saw a shadow move. It was a figure, slowly walking, dragging its feet across the old floorboards. I didn't recognize it first, but when the figure came closer, I realized it was my grandmother. She was standing in the doorway, her frail, sickly body barely holding itself up. She was hunched, her skin pale, and the expression on her face was hard to read. I couldn't tell if she was confused or if it was just the weight of her illness, but something about the sight made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I could see her clearly in the dim light, and for a moment, my mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. My grandmother had been bedridden for weeks, too weak to even get out of bed, let alone walk across the house. And yet, there she was, standing in the doorway like she was going about her usual business. My mother didn't move. She just sat there, her face drained of color, staring at her own mother as she shuffled into the room. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think, but I felt a deep, growing unease. My grandmother didn't speak. She didn't say a word. She simply walked into the room, past my mother's bed, and out the door. I didn't move either. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. Why was she up? Why had she come into our room? And why had she walked away without a word? Was she disoriented? Was she confused? I looked at my mother, but she was still frozen, her face pale and blank, as if she hadn't even seen the same thing I had. My mother's eyes flickered toward me for a split second, but she didn't say anything. She didn't move. She didn't react. Nothing. I waited a few seconds before slowly getting out of bed and walking toward the hallway. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my feet moving almost mechanically. I didn't want to follow her, but I had to know what was going on. I crept down the hall, trying not to make a sound, and when I reached my grandmother's room, I froze. She was lying there, exactly as she had been when I last saw her, pale, unmoving, her body frail and lifeless. I took a step back, feeling as if the world around me had just flipped upside down. I turned and ran back down the hallway to my mother's room, almost tripping over my feet in my panic. My mother was still sitting on the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her face blank and expressionless. "Mom," I said, voice shaking. "Grandma's gone." My mother's eyes slowly came into focus. For a long moment, she just stared at me, as if she was trying to understand what I was saying. Then, finally she spoke. "What?" she whispered. "Grandma." I repeated, my voice breaking. "She's gone." But that was when it hit me. My mother hadn't reacted to the sight of my grandmother standing in the doorway. She hadn't even seemed to notice her walking out of the room. I had seen it clearly. I had watched my grandmother shuffle out of our room, but my mother had not seen it. She hadn't moved. She hadn't reacted. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt sick to my stomach. I grabbed her arm, shaking her urgently. "Mom, you didn't see her? You didn't see Grandma walking? She was just here, in the doorway." My mother looked at me with confusion in her eyes, as if I were speaking a foreign language. "What are you talking about? I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything." She looked around the room, almost like she was trying to piece together what I was saying, but it was clear she couldn't make sense of it. It didn't add up. The hours that followed were filled with a strange, heavy silence. I tried to talk to my mother, but she seemed lost, as if the night had just passed in a blur for her. It was like she had no memory of the strange incident that had unfolded in the dead of night. I kept thinking about what I had seen. Had I imagined it? No, I knew what I saw. My grandmother had been up, walking through our house. But my mother had no recollection of it, no memory of hearing anything, no memory of waking up. She couldn't even remember what had woken her up in the first place. The next day, we went through the motions of saying goodbye. The reality of my grandmother's death slowly sunk in. She was gone, and there was no escaping that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened that night that wasn't right. Something wasn't adding up. As the years went by, I eventually worked up the courage to ask my mother about that night. I don't know why I never asked sooner, but I suppose I was afraid of what I might hear. I was afraid that maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But when I brought it up, my mother's face went pale. She looked at me as though I had just asked her about something that had never happened. "I don't remember anything," she said softly. "I don't remember waking you up. I don't remember your grandmother getting up or walking around. I don't even remember hearing anything." I stared at her, feeling that same creeping dread that I had felt years before. How could she not remember? How could she not remember the moment that felt so real to me? My mother never remembered that night, and I never could forget it. The memory of seeing my grandmother, fragile and bedridden, walking through our house in the dead of night, never left me. It was a part of me now, as much as the fear and confusion of that moment would always be a part of my history. But there's one thing I can't shake, no matter how many years go by. What if my grandmother knew? What if she somehow knew what was happening, knew she was about to leave us, and wanted to say goodbye in her own way? What if she was trying to tell us something, and I was the only one who saw it? Maybe there was no grand meaning behind it, no supernatural explanation. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence, a trick of the mind in the midst of grief. But I don't think it was. Something in me tells me that night wasn't just a bad dream. Something was trying to get through, and I was the only one who witnessed it, and I will never forget. I used to work for my uncle when I was younger. He wasn't a typical 9 to 5 kind of guy. In fact, he did all sorts of things to make ends meet, but one thing he stuck with was painting houses. Every summer and into late fall, he would put up his business sign on the side of his truck, load up his tools, and take on jobs that would keep him busy for days, sometimes even weeks. He was known in town as someone who always did a solid job, so his clients kept coming back, and word of mouth brought him more work. I remember the days when he'd call my dad, asking if I could help him out. Sometimes it was because he was behind on jobs or needed an extra hand, or sometimes because he just needed someone to carry supplies or hold the ladder. No big deal, really. It was just painting houses. How hard could that be? I was a teenager at the time, and it wasn't like I had anything else to do. Plus, the pay was decent, and I didn't mind getting my hands dirty. Most of the jobs were routine. You show up, set up the scaffolding, mix the paint, and start working. Sure, there were days where the weather wasn't on our side, where rain kept us from working. But that was fine. My uncle was smart about it and kept a good schedule, juggling multiple houses at once. There were a lot of jobs, and each one came with its own set of challenges, but none of them ever really felt out of the ordinary. That is, until the fall of one particular year. That year was a wet one. It rained constantly, almost every day, so it made everything harder. The houses we were working on got put on hold more times than I could count, and the schedule got backed up. My uncle had multiple houses on his list, and we had to catch up. I ended up working a lot more than usual. It wasn't a big deal to me. It just meant more hours, more pay. I didn't mind. I was young, eager to make money, and happy to help my uncle out whenever he needed it. One afternoon, my uncle called me up and said we had to head to an old Victorian house on the far side of town. The lady who lived there had called him, desperate to get the job done quickly. Her husband, an author, was having trouble writing his next book because he kept getting distracted by the scaffolding outside the house. It wasn't like we hadn't heard this kind of thing before. People often wanted things finished as soon as possible, but they were nice about it. My uncle liked keeping his customers happy, and so we decided to make this one a priority. I remember that day clearly. It was a warm day for late fall, but there was still a chill in the air. It was that kind of chill that burrows deep into your bones and makes you feel like something's not quite right. The sky was overcast, and everything outside had a strange stillness to it, like the calm before a storm. There was no wind, no movement, just the quiet weight of the day pressing down on everything. When we got to the house, it was even stranger. The front of the house had already been finished, but the back, well, that's where we had to work. My uncle pointed out that the back section still needed a lot of work, so we moved around the side of the house and started setting up. As I walked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd worked on houses before, but this one felt different. It was old, worn down, the kind of house that looked like it had seen better days. It stood tall and imposing, almost like it was watching you. My uncle asked me if I was afraid of heights. I was 17 at the time, and while heights had always made me uneasy, I didn't want to seem like a kid in front of my uncle. I told him no, that I wasn't scared, even though something inside me stirred when I looked up at the scaffolding. He smiled, clearly relieved. He was always the professional, always calm, always cool-headed. He had me climb up the scaffolding to the third floor, where there was a small section of the house left to paint. The house's roof line sloped steeply, and the window at the top was oval-shaped, looking out over the yard. I could see the backyard through it, and I assumed that the room on the other side of the window was the husband's study. My uncle had mentioned something about the man being a writer. He said the guy was struggling with his next book, which is why he was so distracted by the noise outside. I didn't think much of it at the time. Writers had their quirks, right? I climbed up, balancing the cans of paint and brushes in my arms. The higher I went, the more my stomach churned, but I gritted my teeth and kept climbing. Once I got to the top, I set my supplies down on the scaffolding and opened up a can of paint. It was like any other job. I dipped my brush into the paint and started working. The day was gray and quiet. There was no breeze, nothing to break the stillness of the air. I was focused on my task, moving across the top of the house and getting the first coat of paint on the surface. The job itself wasn't hard. It wasn't rocket science, after all. But as I worked my way across, I couldn't help but notice the window, the one looking into the study. It was in my direct line of sight, and I found myself glancing at it every few seconds. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing games with me. But then I saw him, standing at the window, staring back at me. The man was tall, wearing a dark sweater, and he looked like any ordinary person. But there was something about his face that unsettled me. His expression was completely blank, almost like he wasn't really seeing me. He didn't blink, didn't move. He just stood there, staring with eyes that seemed empty. I know it sounds crazy, but in that moment, I felt like I was looking into the face of someone who had completely given up. I froze. It was like the world around me stopped for a second. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know why, but I couldn't look away. The man didn't look away either. He just stood there, staring straight at me. Then, something happened that I'll never forget. Without warning, the man raised a gun to his head. He did it slowly, almost methodically, never breaking eye contact. My heart stopped as he pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, sharp, like the world itself had cracked in two. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind was screaming at me to look away, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. His body didn't fall, didn't twitch. He just slumped, as if he had let go of everything. It wasn't real, it couldn't be, but it was. And in that moment, I felt like the whole world had gone dark. I let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward. My body acted on instinct as I tried to retreat, but I was too close to the edge of the scaffolding, and before I could catch myself, I lost my balance. I remember the sudden rush of air as I fell, the ground rushing up to meet me. I screamed, but it wasn't loud enough to reach anyone. The next thing I knew, I was crashing through branches, landing hard in a bush below. My ankle twisted painfully, and I could feel the scrapes and cuts all over my body, but I didn't care. The only thing I could think about was the man, the look on his face, that empty, emotionless stare. My uncle had seen me fall. He rushed over in a panic, calling my name as he scrambled down the scaffolding to reach me. He wasn't much of a runner, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He helped me up, asking if I was okay. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even process what had just happened. My mind was a mess of confusion, horror, and disbelief. I had broken my ankle, but it was nothing compared to the mental wounds I carried with me. The doctors did what they could, but there was nothing anyone could do about the image of that man's face, the emptiness that stared back at me. I ended up in counseling for a while after that. The doctor said it was normal for someone to experience trauma after seeing something like that, but the truth was I never really recovered. I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I tried to move on, to forget, but I never could. As for the house, it was never finished. My uncle told me that the wife moved out shortly after the incident. They said it was because of personal issues, that the man had been struggling for a long time. But to me, it seemed like something else. I never found out the full story, and part of me didn't want to. The house was left abandoned, and I've never been able to drive by it without feeling a chill. Every time I pass that street, I can't help but glance at the backyard. I don't know why, but I always do. I don't want to see anything, but a part of me wonders if, just for a moment, I'll catch a glimpse of that man's face again. Cold, emotionless, staring back at me from that attic window. I lived in a bizarre little house as a child. It was one of those places you look back on and can't quite believe existed, but it was home to me for years. The house was incredibly tall and thin, like one of those long, narrow townhouses you'd see in some big city, but it was freestanding. 3 floors, a basement, and an attic, each one more strange than the last. It had quirks that only a house built by someone who'd lost their mind could have. 2 fully functional fireplaces that seemed to do nothing but eat wood. A shower stall in the center of the basement, which was never used, and a backyard so small that you couldn't take 5 steps without hitting the fence. The backyard felt like it was a forgotten afterthought, wedged in the space between the back of the house and the next lot. And then there was the dumbwaiter, this old-timey rope pull contraption that led from the kitchen to my bedroom. I used it to send snacks, books, and sometimes even my dirty laundry up and down like some strange personal delivery system. I loved that weird little place. It had this odd charm that I couldn't quite explain, even as a child. I think part of it was that it was just so different. It was clear that whoever designed it had no regard for what made sense or what was practical. They just built whatever came to their minds. But there was a dark side to it, too. The house was incredibly old. You could feel the age in the floors beneath your feet, the creak of the walls, the way the doors stuck when you tried to open them. It was a place that had seen too much and had been left to rot in parts. We never had the money to properly repair it, and eventually, the repair costs exceeded what my parents were willing to sink into it, so we had to move. Packing up to leave was a chore. Most of it was easy. I could throw things away without much thought. I did the majority of the packing myself. The house had grown too small for all the stuff we had accumulated over the years, so my room had become this chaotic mass of things crammed into every available space. I'd taken to throwing things down the dumbwaiter, just for fun. I'd send toys, old books, and clothes up to my room without thinking twice. My closet had become so overloaded with clothes that it turned into this one solid mass of fabric, wedged so tight I could hardly even get the door closed. but it was all part of the process. A mess, yes, but I wasn't bothered by it. It wasn't until I was clearing out my closet that I found something strange. A small, almost hidden door in the roof of the closet. I'd never noticed it before. It was one of those things that blends into the background until something compels you to look. The door was small, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, and made of the same wood as the ceiling. It was sealed tightly, but after a little tug, it gave way with a groan. Curiosity got the best of me. I was an adventurous kid, always looking for something new to explore. I stood on top of the fabric-clothed mound that had taken over the closet and pulled myself up into the attic entrance. It was tight, but I was small, so I fit. I climbed up and through, emerging into the attic for the first time in my life. It wasn't as dark as I expected. The attic was dimly lit by strings of old, red Christmas lights that still burned faintly, their glow casting a sickly hue on the walls and the cluttered space around me. There was something surreal about it, the way the light flickered just slightly, as if it had been on for decades. The walls had strange holes and cracks, some big enough to peer through. From the angles I stood at, I could see into every bedroom in the house below, as though the attic was the watchful eye of the entire building. The second thing I noticed, which was far more unsettling, was that the attic was clearly set up for someone to live in. It wasn't just a storage space. No, this was a habitation. The insulation was ripped away, exposed wood beams running across the ceiling. An old gurney sat in the middle of the room, stacked high with sleeping bags and faded sheets. There was also a refrigerator, an old, mint green one, rusted with age but still humming with life when I walked up to test it. It wasn't plugged in, just sitting there, looking as though someone had abandoned it long ago. But the real thing that made my stomach turn were the bones. There were bones, lots of them. At first, I didn't even understand what I was seeing. I had no idea what kind of bones they were. Animal? Human? I was a kid, and I had a limited understanding of anatomy. But what I did know was that there were dozens, maybe even hundreds of them scattered around the floor. They were small and large, white and clean, stacked haphazardly in piles. Some were carefully arranged, others tossed about carelessly. There was something incredibly unsettling about the way they were grouped together. 2 of the piles were darker, blackened at the edges, as if someone had tried to burn them. I leaned closer, and I could see that the walls near these blackened piles were scrawled with strange marks, smeared, faint messages written in what appeared to be ash or bone dust. I could make out a few words. "Sorry" was the most prominent. It appeared more than once, scratched into the wall, as though someone had desperately written it. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't understand it, but I felt the weight of it. There was something so wrong about it, like the space itself was suffocating. I didn't go any closer to the piles. I didn't need to. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. The attic had been there for 8 years, sitting right above me while I slept. All that time, I'd been unaware of the horrors that were piled above me. I don't know what possessed me to stand there for as long as I did, staring at the bones. My legs started to feel weak, and my mind was whirling with questions I couldn't answer. Who had put these bones here? Why? How long had they been there? What had happened in this house before I had lived here? These were the thoughts that plagued me as I stood there, my gaze darting around the attic, my breathing shallow. Suddenly, the creaking of the house brought me back to reality. I could hear the sound of my parents moving around downstairs, preparing for the move. They had no idea what I had found, and I didn't know how to explain it. What could I even say? I found bones in the attic. No, that wasn't something you casually mention. It would be too weird, too terrifying. And I had no answers, no explanation. I took a few steps back, my heart pounding in my chest, and I pulled myself out of the attic. I didn't bother closing the door behind me. Instead, I just sat in the corner of my room, staring at the wall, unable to shake the image of those bones and the unsettling word "sorry" etched into the walls. My mind kept going over everything, but no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't make sense of what I'd found. It was as if someone had created this room, this secret, hidden room, for something that wasn't meant to be uncovered, something that was meant to stay buried. That was the last time I ever went up there. The next day, I told my parents I had found something weird in the attic, but I didn't mention the bones. I couldn't bring myself to. I didn't know how to. It felt like it was something beyond my understanding, something that didn't belong in a kid's world. We moved out a few days later, and I left the house behind, but I never forgot about that attic. Every time I thought back on it, I wondered who had lived in that house before us. What had they done? What was the meaning of those bones and the cryptic messages in the walls? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know this. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some things shouldn't be uncovered, no matter how much curiosity gnaws at you. When we moved from the bustling urban sprawl of South Florida to the quiet, isolated town of North Florida, I was only 8 years old. It was a drastic shift, like something out of a Goosebumps book. The small town was nothing like what we were used to. There was no traffic, no crowded shopping malls, no constant buzz of activity. Just forests, dirt roads, and a handful of houses scattered across the land like forgotten relics. My parents, both in search of a fresh start, bought a small trailer tucked deep in the woods, where the trees seemed to have no end. At first, I didn't mind the change. The woods were different, sure, but they were peaceful, quiet. There was something almost calming about it. But soon, I noticed strange things happening, things that didn't sit right, things that made me question everything I thought I knew about this town. My sister, Rachel, had just gotten married when we moved, and I remember her visiting us on the weekends. But after a few months, things started to change for her. Her husband, who had been deployed to Afghanistan, was gone for months on end, and she was left to raise their newborn son on her own. She didn't want to stay in their tiny house in the middle of nowhere, alone with a baby. So, she moved in with my parents for a while, and that's when everything began to spiral. It started small at first, little things that she didn't think much of. At night, she'd hear the headboard of her bed slam against the wall. It wasn't always loud, but it was enough to wake her up. She tried to convince herself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind causing the vibrations. But then things escalated. One night, she woke up with the unsettling sensation that someone was touching her. At first, she thought it was just a dream or a trick of her half-sleeping mind. But as the sensation continued, she realized someone, or something, was actually tickling her. It wasn't playful. It was unnerving, like someone was trying to provoke a reaction out of her. She told herself it was just the stress of being alone, adjusting to life with a newborn. But deep down, she felt an unease she couldn't shake off. But things only got worse. One night, my mom was woken by Rachel's screams. I had already been asleep, but I heard the frantic cries of my mom running into Rachel's room. I still remember the sound of her footsteps pounding down the hallway, and the sudden burst of light as she swung open the door. The air was thick with tension. When she entered the room, what she saw made her blood run cold. The bed was shaking violently, almost as if something was beneath it, thrashing around. It wasn't just a little movement. It was like the entire bed was being rocked, violently jerking up and down, side to side, like it was in the middle of a storm. It was the kind of movement you'd expect if someone were underneath, pushing and pulling it with all their strength. But there was no one there. Rachel was in a state of shock, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't even speak. She was frozen in place, clutching the bed frame as if she was holding on for dear life. My mom stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do. She had seen her fair share of strange things over the years, but nothing like this. They didn't talk much about it afterward. They didn't have to. I could see in their faces how deeply unsettled they were. I didn't understand it all at that age, but I felt it too. That sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't just an old house creaking. There was something else there, something hidden in the walls, in the silence of the woods. Rachel tried to move on, tried to convince herself that she was just overreacting. She focused on her son, who was growing up fast, and tried to put the strange occurrences behind her. But then one night, something happened that made it impossible for her to ignore. She was in her room, nursing her son, when it happened again. At first, she thought it was just the usual weariness of motherhood. But then, a sudden, sharp tug on her ponytail yanked her head back. It wasn't like a playful tug or a breeze brushing against her hair. It was deliberate, forceful, as if something was grabbing her, pulling her head back, yanking her hair in a way that left her gasping. She pulled away from her son, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was happening, but the fear in her eyes was enough to tell my mom that this wasn't something normal. She rushed in, and when she saw what was happening, she didn't hesitate. Without a word, she walked into the room and stood at the foot of Rachel's bed. She didn't panic, didn't scream. She just looked at the air, almost as if she was addressing whatever was there. "I understand things are different," my mom said, her voice calm but firm. "There's a little baby here, and there never has been before. I know you're curious, but you will not touch them anymore. You can look, you can stay. You were here before us. But I swear to God, you are not allowed to touch them." It was the strangest thing I had ever witnessed. My mom didn't sound scared. In fact, there was something so certain in her voice that I couldn't help but believe she knew exactly what she was doing. And just like that, the disturbances stopped. For weeks, there was nothing. The headboard no longer slammed against the wall. The bed stopped rocking. The sensation of being touched, of someone or something brushing against her skin, gone. It was like whatever had been lurking in the shadows had retreated, and for the first time in months, Rachel could sleep peacefully again. But the thing is, I don't think it really ever left. Not entirely. I never talked about it, not even with Rachel. I didn't want to sound crazy, didn't want to admit that I still heard things sometimes. Scratching sound from behind the walls, whispers carried on the wind, things that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. Maybe it was just the isolation or maybe it was the woods, but I always felt like something was out there, watching. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was still, I could almost hear the faint sound of someone laughing. Not in a good way. As for Rachel, she never brought it up again, but I could see the unease in her eyes when she stayed in that room. It wasn't fear anymore, but something else. Maybe she had learned to accept it, whatever it was. But I knew she hadn't forgotten, and neither had I. Years passed and life went on. We all moved out of that trailer eventually. My parents built a new house, and Rachel and her son moved on with their lives. But something lingered in that old place. Something we could never shake, no matter how hard we tried to ignore it. I don't know if it was a ghost, or just the house settling, or something else entirely. All I know is that after my mom's words that night, the strange event stopped. Maybe it was her strength that scared whatever it was into silence. Maybe it was the way she stood her ground, knowing that she couldn't let whatever had been there hurt her family. But for whatever reason, it worked. And after that, the house was quiet. The woods were quiet. Everything returned to normal, at least for a while. I think about it sometimes, about the way Rachel must have felt in those nights when she was alone with her son, about the terror in her eyes when she called for help. And I wonder, what would have happened if my mom hadn't stepped in? Would the bed have kept shaking? Would Rachel have been pulled into the dark? I'll never know for sure. But whatever it was, whatever was lurking in the shadows of that old trailer, it's gone now. And I hope it stays gone for good. It was 3:34 a.m. when I woke up. The digital clock on my nightstand flashed a cold, bright red, and for a split second, I thought I was still dreaming. I lay there, motionless, staring at the glowing numbers, trying to shake off the fogginess from my sleep. The room was completely black, the kind of dark where you couldn't see anything, not even your own hand in front of your face. I blinked several times, adjusting to the darkness. There was no sound, nothing. The usual hum of the house, the refrigerator, the slight creak of the floorboards settling, was gone. That's when I heard it, a rattling noise. It came from downstairs in the living room, followed by a faint, muffled thud. My heart skipped a beat. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something else that could explain the noise, but there was nothing. I lay there frozen, my breath caught in my chest. Another noise came from downstairs, the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the floor. I pushed the covers off me and swung my legs out of bed. My feet hit the cold floor, sending a shiver up my spine. I stood up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind raced. What was that? Was someone downstairs? It wasn't normal, not for this time of night. I glanced at the clock again. 3:34 a.m. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe something simple like the wind rattling the house or the pipes making noise. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I tiptoed across my room, moving as silently as I could. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, but I knew there was no avoiding it. I made my way to my parents' room, praying they were just awake, maybe dealing with something that was making the noise downstairs. When I reached the door, I slowly turned the knob and peeked inside. It was empty. The bed was made, the pillows untouched. It felt wrong. Where were they? My parents weren't the type to just disappear in the middle of the night. I quickly shut the door and walked down the hall to my brother's room. He was usually awake at this hour, always messing with something on his computer or playing video games. His door was slightly ajar, and there was a faint light coming from under the door. I could hear the soft hum of his desk lamp, but when I pushed the door open, I saw that his bed was empty. His chair was turned away from the desk, and the light was still on, casting long shadows on the walls. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. Where could they have gone? Why would they leave the house at 3:34 a.m.? Maybe something happened. Maybe someone called them, or no. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe something happened to someone close to us. But still, why was the house so quiet? It didn't make sense. The rattling from downstairs came again, louder this time, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was definitely not the wind, and it wasn't normal. I needed to check it out. I turned and headed downstairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like lead as I moved down the stairs as quietly as possible. I reached the bottom and froze in the doorway of the living room. There were two men in the middle of the room, standing in front of the television. They were taking it off the stand, their backs to me. They didn't notice me. They were too focused on what they were doing. One of them was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, his hair shaved close to his scalp. The other was shorter, stockier, with a scruffy beard and a hood pulled low over his head. Neither of them spoke, but they moved quickly, like they knew exactly what they were doing. My stomach dropped. I had no idea what to do. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do something, but I couldn't move. It was like my body wouldn't obey. I backed away from the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest. What were they doing here? What was going on? Why hadn't my parents stopped them? I turned and ran up the stairs, careful not to make any noise. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it, leaning against it, gasping for breath. I tried to steady myself, my mind racing with questions. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop them. I felt a cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I could hear the faint sounds of footsteps, like someone was moving around in the hallway. Then, the banging started. It was loud, the sound of fists pounding against my door, hard enough to rattle the hinges. My heart leapt into my throat. Whoever those men were, they were trying to get in. "Open the door," one of them shouted, his voice muffled by the door. I stayed silent, my back pressed against the wall, my breathing shallow and quick. I didn't know what they wanted, but I couldn't open the door. I couldn't risk it. They were after something, maybe the TV, maybe something else. The banging continued. It grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear the frustration in their voices. "Open the door, kid," one of them yelled again, his voice rising in pitch. I couldn't let them in. My hands were sweating as I clutched the door handle. My mind raced, looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. My windows were locked, and even if I tried to jump out, I knew I wouldn't make it far before they caught me. Suddenly, everything went still. The banging stopped. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Then I woke up. The sound of my own breath filled my ears, ragged and frantic. My eyes shot open, and I looked around the room. It was pitch black, just like before. The clock on my nightstand blinked 3:34 a.m. I lay there for a long time, just staring at the clock, trying to process what had just happened. It was so real. I could still hear their voices in my head, the sound of their fists against my door. I could feel my heart racing, the cold sweat on my skin. I let out a shaky breath and tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe it was all just a nightmare, a product of my overactive imagination. But something didn't feel right. My mind kept replaying the same sequence of events over and over. I was terrified, but I had to check. I had to prove to myself that everything was fine, that it was just a dream. I dragged myself out of bed and walked slowly downstairs. My legs felt like lead, my feet dragging with each step. I reached the bottom and hesitated at the living room doorway. The house was quiet, too quiet. I slowly pushed the door open, and there they were, two men, just like in my dream, standing in the kitchen. They were yelling at my parents and brother, who were backed into a corner. I could hear the panic in their voices, but there was nothing I could do. I didn't know what they wanted or why they were there, but I couldn't stay. I ran back up the stairs, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my body shaking with fear. Then, the banging started again. It was real this time. The pounding on the door was louder, harder. I could hear the men outside, their voices muffled, angry. They were demanding to be let in. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, I woke up again. It was 3:34 a.m. Again, I stared at the clock, my body frozen with fear. This time, I couldn't convince myself it was just a dream. It was real. Somehow it was real. I didn't sleep again that night. In fact, I didn't manage to sleep at all for the next 36 hours. The fear, the panic, it all stayed with me. The same haunting feeling of those men in my house, the sound of the banging on the door, the helplessness that gripped me. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't safe, that whatever happened in those dreams, it wasn't just a dream. I never did find out what those men wanted. But I know one thing, I wasn't the only one who heard them. I was in high school, doing homework at the dining room table one evening. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when it's just you at home and the world outside feels like it's far away. The only noise was the scratch of my pen against paper, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the occasional car passing by on the road outside. My dad wasn't home. He worked late on Tuesdays, and my mom was out with some friends. It was about 9 p.m., so the darkness outside was complete except for the faint glow of the streetlights down the road. I had a good view of the front door from where I sat at the table. The front door had a large pane of glass, around 2 feet by 5 feet, and a lace curtain that hung over it. It wasn't a curtain you could see through, but it wasn't heavy either, the kind that let light filter through, but kept most of the view blocked. It was a typical suburban house, with a wide porch, a wooden railing, and a screen door that led to the outside. My chair faced toward the front door, and sometimes I would get distracted just staring out into the night, watching the empty porch and the quiet street. I don't know how long I'd been sitting there, but something changed. I heard a noise, faint at first, like the creak of the porch floorboards. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me sit up straighter. I looked toward the front door instinctively, but it was still too dark to see much. The porch light wasn't on, and it was like everything outside had been swallowed by the night. The streetlight gave just enough light to create shadows, but nothing more. Then I saw it. The screen door. It moved. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the wind or something, but no, it was clearly moving. The door pushed inward, just enough to swing slightly open. I could see it through the pane of glass and the lace curtain, just a small opening at first, and then the door stood there, partially ajar. The kind of opening that someone would create if they were standing right outside, and gently pushed it open, almost cautiously. I froze. My heart started to race, and every instinct in my body told me to get up, check the door, do something. But my legs were heavy, and my hands gripped the pen in front of me so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what was happening. Was someone out there? Could I hear footsteps? Could they see me? For a long minute, nothing else happened. The door stayed open, swaying gently as if a breath of wind were moving it. The darkness outside felt more oppressive now, and I felt like the night itself had grown heavier, thicker, as if it were watching me. I leaned forward in my chair, trying to make sense of it. I didn't move. I didn't want to make any noise to give myself away. I could still see the screen door, but the rest of the porch was just shadows. The light from inside didn't really reach that far. And then I saw something else. The door was slowly, almost carefully, closing. It wasn't slamming shut, like someone trying to leave quickly. No, it was being closed slowly, as if the person, whoever was outside, was trying to be as quiet as possible, not wanting to make any noise at all. The creak of the door frame as it closed was barely audible, but I heard it. Why would someone close the door like that? If they were coming in, why stop? If they were leaving, why bother closing it so carefully? The more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. I didn't hear footsteps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was standing just outside, watching. I knew there were no other houses close by, no reason for anyone to be there. No one would be walking on our porch at this hour, in the pitch-black darkness. Not without a reason. I watched the door close fully. The silence that followed was almost too loud. My ears started to ring as I waited, my eyes still locked on the door. Nothing. The world outside remained still, the dark porch and empty yard. I felt like time had frozen. I sat there for what felt like hours, but I'm sure it was only a few minutes. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone out there? Was it just the wind? But the door, no, that wasn't the wind. The door had moved too deliberately, and that closing so carefully, I couldn't explain it. I wanted to get up, to look outside, to make sure everything was all right. But every fiber in my body screamed not to. What if someone was waiting out there, watching me? What if they had seen me looking at them through the glass, and now they were waiting for me to make a move? The thought of getting up from my chair seemed impossible. The darkness outside was consuming, and I felt small and exposed, trapped behind the glass and the lace curtain. The light inside the house was a comfort, but the thought of stepping into the night felt like stepping into something much darker, something I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know how much time passed before I finally forced myself to move. The tension in my body had built to a breaking point, and I needed to do something. Anything. I grabbed my phone from the table, but when I glanced at the screen, I saw that I had no service. I cursed under my breath. Of course, there was no service. I lived in a neighborhood where the signal was spotty, but it always seemed to drop at the worst times. I decided to check the door. Maybe it had just been the wind, or maybe I had imagined it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up slowly, my feet hesitant, my mind racing. I walked toward the door, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. My breath felt shallow, and every step I took felt too loud, like I was giving away my position. When I reached the door, I stood there for a moment, gathering my courage. I reached for the doorknob and turned it, the metal cold in my hand. Slowly, I opened the door, and the silence outside was almost deafening. The porch was empty. No one was standing there. No shadows in the dark. Just a quiet night air and the empty street. I stepped outside, my heart still racing. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I looked around the porch, but there was no sign of anyone, nothing out of place. The screen door was closed all the way, just as I had seen it through the glass. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the yard, but there was nothing. No one. I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Had I imagined it? Had it all just been some weird trick of the shadows or the wind? I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of unease still lingered. I was standing on the porch, looking out into the darkness, when I heard something. A faint rustling sound. It came from behind me, from the direction of the bushes by the side of the house. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, but again, nothing was there. I stepped forward, feeling my pulse pounding in my ears, and I moved toward the bushes. As I got closer, I felt a strange sensation, like I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me. I reached the edge of the bushes and hesitated. My eyes darted back toward the porch, but I saw nothing. There was no movement, no sound, no sign of anyone nearby. Just the dark, silent yard stretching out before me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then finally, the world around me began to settle. I took one last look at the empty yard, then turned back and walked inside. I closed the door softly behind me, locking it. The silence in the house was almost comforting after the tension outside. I felt my heart slowly begin to calm, though the sense of unease didn't fully leave me. I sat back down at the dining table, trying to focus on my homework again. But every now and then, I glanced toward the front door, half expecting to see the screen door moving again, or someone standing there in the dark, watching. But the door stayed still, and the night went on, just as it always had. We were just kids, barely 13 or 14, skating down the streets of our small town. Skating was the one thing we all had in common. Me, Tim, and Brandon. Every day after school, we'd meet up at the local skate park, push ourselves to do tricks, or just ride around the town until it got dark. That day was no different. We had just finished skating and were headed to the 7-Eleven for some drinks and snacks before we went home. It was just another ordinary stop, something we did 100 times before. But that day, everything changed. We walked into the store, laughing and joking around, not really thinking about anything beyond getting our snacks. I remember Tim bought a Mountain Dew, Brandon grabbed a bag of chips, and I got a bottle of water. Simple stuff. We didn't even realize that it was already starting to get dark outside. Time just slipped away as we stood in line, too caught up in talking to notice how late it had gotten. When we paid and left the store, the night air hit me all at once, a bit cooler than usual for the time of year. We stepped out into the parking lot, and without much of a plan, we headed toward the street, getting ready to cross the highway. It wasn't a busy highway, more like a small town main road with a few cars here and there. Still, it was enough to make you careful, especially when you had to cross. We were waiting for the light to turn red, just hanging out, talking about random stuff. I glanced behind me and saw a guy standing by the 7-Eleven gas pumps. He was an older man, probably in his 40s or 50s, pumping gas into his truck. Nothing weird about that, just a guy going about his business. But then, for some reason, he started staring at me. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. But no, he was definitely looking right at me hard. It wasn't a casual glance. It was the kind of stare that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off, but something about it felt off. And before I could even make sense of the situation, he dropped the gas pump, jumped into his truck, and slammed on the gas. The truck roared to life, and before I knew what was happening, he was speeding right toward us. My heart jumped into my throat as I saw the headlights bearing down on us. Too fast, too close. I didn't have time to think, only to react. I shoved Brandon and Tim out of the way just as the truck came at us. I felt the truck's bumper graze my arm, hard, knocking me off balance. My skateboard flew out of my hand and slid across the pavement, but I didn't have time to worry about it. I barely managed to stay on my feet as the truck shot past us, engine screaming. Brandon shouted after the guy, his voice thick with anger and disbelief. "What the hell, you F? ING dick." His words were barely out of his mouth when the truck screeched around the corner and shot into the parking lot next to 7-Eleven. My pulse was hammering in my chest, and my mind was trying to catch up with what had just happened. Then it got worse. The maniac in the white truck wasn't done. He didn't just speed off. No, he drove through a ditch that separated the two parking lots. And then he turned his truck right toward us again. The maniac was coming back for us. No hesitation, no second thoughts. The next few seconds felt like they dragged on forever. Tim and Brandon had already started running, but I froze for just a moment, my legs locked in place as the reality of the situation sank in. The truck was coming straight at us, and I could see the rage in the driver's face as he swerved toward us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, like it might burst. But there was no time to think, no time to panic. I turned and ran with everything I had, my legs burning as I sprinted across the street. I had to make it to the library. It was the only place close enough where we could get away. Tim and Brandon were already ahead of me, pushing open the library doors as I kept running. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to get away. And then, I dared to glance behind me. The truck was still chasing us. It was closing in fast, way too fast. I could see the headlights and the truck's grill coming up over the curb, the tires skidding on the pavement as he pushed the truck harder. I thought I was going to die right there on the street. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I pushed myself harder, legs moving faster than I ever thought they could. I looked ahead, desperate for the safety of the library, but then my thoughts shifted. There was no way he'd catch me. I had to lose him. So at the last possible second, I turned and darted toward the woods. I didn't even hesitate. It was a gamble, but I knew if I kept running down the street, he'd catch me. And if I went into the woods, I could lose him in the trees. I could hear the truck's engine roaring in my ears as I ran, the noise deafening. But as soon as I hit the edge of the woods, I felt a tiny bit of relief. The trees were thick, the brush heavy. It was harder to see, harder for him to follow. I pushed through the underbrush, the branches tearing at my clothes and skin as I ran deeper into the woods. I looked back just once and I saw him. He was out of the truck now, holding something in his hands. A shotgun? A crowbar? I wasn't sure, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. I couldn't risk it. I sprinted faster, ignoring the pain in my legs, the sharp sting of branches whipping past my face. I had to get home. I had to get away from this guy. Finally, I broke out of the trees and hit the road that led to my house. My heart was still pounding, but I could see the familiar houses, the streetlights flickering in the distance. I didn't stop running until I reached my street. I was gasping for air, my body trembling with adrenaline, but I didn't care. I made it home. When I got there, I barely had the energy to make sense of what had happened. My neighbor, Tim's dad, was there. He saw me coming up the street, out of breath, covered in scratches and dirt. He told me to get in his car. We had to go to the video store. It wasn't until I got to the video store that I saw Tim and Brandon again. They were already there, talking to 3 police officers. Tim and Brandon had both been scared out of their minds. They didn't know if I was alive or not. They had no idea where I'd gone, but they knew I was in trouble. Tim told me later that he had seen the man chasing me into the woods. The cops were talking to them, asking questions, but my mind was still reeling. I was still trying to process the fact that this guy had tried to kill us. And the worst part, he was never caught. I don't know if he went to jail or if he just disappeared, but I never heard anything else about him. I spent the next 5 years of my life looking over my shoulder, always on edge whenever I saw a white truck driving around town. I remember the faces of all those people who had seen what was happening too. There were so many people around, standing on the sidewalk, sitting in their cars and just watching. Nobody did a thing. Nobody helped. It felt like I was running for my life, surrounded by people who just didn't care enough to do anything about it. That's what sticks with me the most, the helplessness of it all. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he came after us. It was pure rage. I still see it in my nightmares sometimes, and whenever I hear the sound of a truck engine in the distance, I can't help but wonder if he's out there somewhere, still looking for us. It's been years since that night, and I don't know if I'll ever get the answers I need. But I do know this. I'll never forget the fear I felt running for my life, and I'll never forget the man who tried to take it from me. When I was a kid, we moved into a house that I'd end up calling home for most of my early years. It wasn't anything special, just a regular suburban house in a quiet neighborhood, but something about it made me uneasy from the very start. My parents didn't seem to notice anything strange, or at least they didn't mention it. But for me, it was different. From the moment we stepped inside, something just felt off, like the air was a little thicker, heavier in a way. I remember the first night we spent in that house. The house had the usual creaks and groans of an old building, and while I expected that, there was something more, something extra that didn't sit right. I was about 8 at the time, and when you're that age, you're naturally more sensitive to things around you. At least, that's what I tell myself now when I think back. But as I sat there in my room, unpacking toys and setting in my new space, I could have sworn I heard my dad's voice calling me from the other end of the house. It was faint at first, like a soft whisper carried on the air. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I thought maybe he needed help with something, or maybe he was just calling me to come downstairs. I got up, walked down the hallway, and knocked on my parents' bedroom door. They were both sitting there, my dad flipping through a book and my mom watching TV. "What's up?" my mom asked. "Did you call me?" I asked, looking between the two of them. They both looked at me like I had lost my mind. "No, we didn't call you," my dad said, frowning a little. "You okay?" I didn't really understand it. Maybe I was just hearing things, I thought. Maybe I had imagined it. After all, I was just a kid, right? So I brushed it off and went back to my room, trying to focus on my Legos. But then it happened again. A few days later, I was in my room, sitting on the floor and building some massive structure when I heard it again. My dad's voice, calling my name from the opposite side of the house. I didn't even hesitate this time. I stood up, walked down the hallway, and knocked on their door again. "Yeah," my dad asked, looking up from his book. "You call me again." I said, a little confused. This time, my mom was there too, and they both looked at each other like they didn't know what I was talking about. "No, we didn't call you," my mom said, her tone gentle, but there was a hint of concern in her voice, like she was worried I was imagining things. It was a little unsettling, but I didn't think much of it. I was a kid, and kids have active imaginations, right? My mind must have been playing tricks on me. But the thing is, it didn't stop. It happened about once every couple of days, sometimes once a week, and every time I would walk down the hallway, knock on my parents' bedroom door, and they'd both look at me like I was crazy. They never called me. I started to get used to it, but that didn't mean it was any less strange. Sometimes I would hear it when I was playing by myself in my room, or sometimes when I was sitting at the kitchen table. It never made sense, but I never mentioned it to anyone else. I figure I was probably the only one hearing it, and that maybe it was just my imagination running wild. One night, it happened again, but this time, something was different. It wasn't my dad's voice calling me. This time, it was my mom's voice. I was sitting in my room, the soft hum of the house around me. I had just finished my homework and was playing with some Legos on the floor. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that comes only late at night, when the world outside seems to be sleeping. Then I heard it, clear as day, my mom's voice calling my name from the living room. It wasn't just faint this time like it usually was. It was loud and clear, like she was standing right outside my door. "Backslash my name, come here," she called. I froze. I was sitting on the floor, staring at the wall for a moment, unsure of what to do. I had heard her voice before, but this felt different. It felt like she was right there in the room with me, even though I could see the hallway from where I was sitting, and there was no one there. I stood up slowly, my heart beating faster in my chest. I walked to the living room, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. My mom wasn't sitting on the couch. The TV was on, but she was nowhere to be found. I turned back, and my dad was still sitting in his chair in the bedroom. I walked into their room and asked them what they wanted. They both looked at me like I was nuts. "We didn't call you," my dad said, his eyebrows furrowing as he stood up from his chair. "Is something wrong?" I shook my head, not sure how to explain it. I wanted to believe that I was just imagining things, but this time, it felt too real. I kept quiet about it for a while after that, but it kept happening. And it wasn't just voices. Sometimes it was sounds. The creak of the floorboards outside my door. The sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway when I was the only one home. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside making the windows creak. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The turning point came a few months later when my brother was diagnosed with narcolepsy. I don't remember the details of how it was discovered. Maybe it was a series of fainting spells, or maybe it was something else, but when the doctors explained it, one of the symptoms of narcolepsy was oral hallucinations. At the time, I thought maybe I had it too. Maybe I was just hearing things, just like my brother sometimes did. I went to the doctor, had some tests done. They told me I was fine. No narcolepsy, no oral hallucinations, nothing that would explain what was going on. I left the doctor's office feeling even more confused. If it wasn't my imagination and it wasn't a medical condition, then what was it? For a long time, I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was messing with me. It wasn't the kind of thing you could just talk about. It wasn't like there was a ghost or something spooky and tangible. It wasn't any of the typical horror stories you hear. It was just a feeling, a presence that lingered, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. I stopped mentioning it to my parents after the doctor's visit, but every time I went to visit after moving out, it would happen again. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, and I could hear my name being called from the hallway. Sometimes I would hear it during the day when everyone was home. The worst part was that it didn't matter where I was in the house. It always came from the farthest end of the house, and every time I went to check, no one would be there. The sound of my name being called still echoes in my mind, even now. I don't visit the house much anymore, but whenever I do, it's the first thing I hear when I step inside. It's a voice calling my name from somewhere in the house, and no matter where I look, no one's ever there. I don't have an explanation for it. It's not something that can be easily brushed off as a trick of the mind. It's not something that can be explained away by science or medicine. All I know is that for years, I heard my name being called from the other side of the house, and I still hear it, even though I haven't lived there in years. It's one of those things that stays with you, gnawing at the edges of your mind, making you question what's real and what isn't. And every time I hear it, it's a reminder that some things can't be explained. Not everything has a reason. I was about 7 years old when the worst thing in my young life happened. It was the kind of day that you just feel free, like the world is your playground, and anything is possible. My 2 older brothers and I were out at what was once a piece of land our town had long ago abandoned. It had turned into a dirt track over time, a place people used for motoring, jumping bikes, and racing. To us, it was the ultimate adventure spot. There was a weird sense of freedom out there, away from parents, away from rules. No one cared what we did out there. We'd already spent a couple of hours out in the sun, running around, exploring. We were 3 young boys, full of energy, no sense of consequences. I remember the dirt was dry, crumbled underfoot in the places we weren't careful, and patches of wild grass poked through here and there. The place smelled of dust, of heat, of something burnt into the earth over the years. But we didn't care. It was our kingdom, our little stretch of wild. I don't know who came up with the idea of digging, but it was one of those moments when you're a kid and you just get an idea in your head and think it's the best thing you've ever thought of. I remember looking at the ground, thinking we could make something with it. Maybe a tunnel? I don't know, but I remember the thrill of it. The idea was absurd. We weren't construction experts, we didn't have shovels, and we definitely didn't know the first thing about building something safe. But none of that stopped us. We didn't have much for tools, but there was a scrap of wood lying around, a few old metal bars left behind by whoever had used the land before us. We used them to pry into the dirt, carving out a little hole at first, then widening it. It didn't take long before we were each working furiously, excited by the idea of having our own secret space, a place only we could fit, a place where no one could find us. We started digging in the ground, and the hole quickly grew larger. It felt like we were doing something important, something that would be remembered. I felt like a little explorer, a miner, digging into the earth with every ounce of strength I had. The deeper we got, the more it felt like we were carving a passage to somewhere far away, like we were uncovering a hidden world. The dirt, dark and heavy, was satisfying to dig through. Every shovel of earth we moved was like we were getting closer to something. But what exactly, I don't know. We didn't have a real plan. It was just fun in a reckless, carefree way. We weren't being careful, not even a little bit. The tunnel was already too deep for the soil to be supported by anything. No bracing, no beams, just dirt, and more dirt. The walls of the tunnel started to soften as the dirt loosened, but it didn't seem to matter. We were so into it that we didn't think about anything else. It wasn't until I was right up against the tunnel's face, hands on the cold, packed dirt, that I noticed how warm it was. Not just warm, but hot, like a furnace, like the air was getting heavy and suffocating. Then, without warning, it happened. The ground trembled beneath me, and I heard the unmistakable sound of shifting dirt. It wasn't a small thing. It was a roar, a thunderous rumble that shook my body, and then before I could even react, it collapsed. The dirt above me caved in, falling in an instant, filling the tunnel with a terrifying force. I don't remember hearing much except for the sudden weight. Everything happened so fast, too fast. In a heartbeat, the world went black. Not the kind of black where your eyes are closed, but the kind of black where you know there's no light at all. My arms were pinned, my chest was pressed hard against the dirt, and I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. There was no way to wiggle out of it, no way to push myself up. I couldn't even take a breath. It was hot. Not just warm, but furnace hot. The kind of heat that you only get when you're trapped, your body wrapped up in something that doesn't give. I started to feel the pressure building on my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. I could still move my fingers a little, but my arms felt like they were made of stone. The dirt was everywhere, filling my mouth, choking me, grinding against my face. I could feel the weight of it on my head, pressing against me, my body trapped under the earth. The air got thinner. The panic started to rise. I couldn't see anything. There was no light, no way of knowing what was happening. My body felt like it was being crushed, my lungs gasping for air that wasn't there. My mind was racing, everything going wrong in an instant. The air was thick, and I could barely breathe. The more I struggled, the more the dirt pressed in. I could feel the weight of it on my chest, on my legs, on my face. The pressure made everything worse. But it wasn't just the lack of air or the crushing weight that scared me. It was the darkness. The total, suffocating darkness. The only thing I could think of, besides the fact that I was probably going to die, was that I was in hell. That was the thought that hit me. It wasn't the hot dirt, the lack of air, or the fact that I couldn't move. No, it was the feeling that I was somewhere bad, somewhere I didn't belong, somewhere I had done something wrong. I wasn't just a scared kid anymore. I was a kid who thought they were in hell. My young mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. And the only thing that made sense was that this was the end. I could feel the blood rushing to my head, making everything go fuzzy. My vision was blurred with the red haze of panic, and each breath felt harder than the last. I have no idea how long I was buried. Time stretched in ways I couldn't understand. It felt like forever. I couldn't even tell if I was breathing anymore, or if I was just struggling. The only thing I could feel was the dirt, tight, hot, suffocating. I could hear the thudding of my heart in my chest, the pressure building. Every breath felt like it was the last one I could take. And then I felt it. A sudden tug, like someone had grabbed my foot. It wasn't a light tug, either. It was a strong pull, a desperate grab. The panic hit me again, and I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. But it came again, stronger this time. The dirt around my foot shifted, and I felt another tug. A real one. I didn't know what it was at first. My mind was so foggy that I couldn't process it. But then I heard voices. My brothers. They had been digging, trying to get to me, trying to pull me out. I heard the frantic scraping of hands against the earth, the desperate pull of dirt being thrown away in chunks. The world was still dark, still suffocating, but I could feel their presence, feel them pulling at me, dragging me out of the earth. It felt like an eternity, but finally, with one last desperate effort, they got me out. I was covered in dirt, my clothes caked in it. I couldn't breathe properly, my body was shaking uncontrollably, and my legs felt like they had no strength in them. But I was out. I was alive. My brothers helped me to my feet, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. They had saved me, but I don't think I could have understood how close I had been to not making it. The whole thing felt like a bad dream, but when I touched my face, when I felt the earth still clinging to my skin, I knew it wasn't. We didn't tell our parents. I don't know why. Maybe we didn't want to get in trouble, or maybe it was just too terrifying to put into words. But I remember feeling like something in me had changed after that. I never forgot the fear I had felt, the terror of being trapped, of thinking I was going to die. It stayed with me for years. I went home that day, covered in dirt and shaking. I don't know if my brothers were the same way, but I was terrified. Terrified of what had almost happened. Terrified of how close I had come to being buried forever. I remember my mom hosing me off in the yard, trying to wash away the dirt and the fear. But no amount of water could clean me completely. That feeling, that sense of being completely helpless, lingered for a long time. I never went back to that spot. I never forgot what it felt like to be buried alive, to be suffocating in the earth, and I never wanted to feel that again. I was 14 when I first started hearing it. My grandparents had a big house, an old one, and I always hated the upstairs. I never went up there alone, even when I was younger. Something about the space unsettled me. Maybe it was the long, narrow hallway, or the odd creaks the floors would make when the wind picked up. I'd never been brave enough to venture up there by myself, even though my cousins and siblings had no problem with it. The upstairs always felt like a place I shouldn't be. It was as if the air was thick, like something was watching from the dark corners. But the worst part, the part that really made me avoid it, was the story my grandparents used to tell me. They had these old tales about the house, the ones they never told when we were all gathered together in the living room. It was always just my grandma or my grandpa telling me alone in whispers late at night when everyone else was asleep. The story was about the previous owners of the house, specifically their sons. According to my grandparents, the sons claimed to have seen something strange in the upstairs bedroom. They called it a gorilla, though I had no idea why. They said it would come out of the closet at night, dance around the room, and then return to the closet. I didn't know what to make of it when I was younger. It seemed like a silly story. But when I started staying on the first floor instead of the second, I found myself remembering it more often than I liked. It started when my grandparents decided it was time for me to move to the first floor. They'd started sleeping in separate rooms, Grandpa in one, Grandma in another, and I had to take the guest room. The guest room was directly below the upstairs bedroom, the one that always gave me chills. The one with the closet where the gorilla was said to come from. I thought the whole thing was stupid, but still, the idea of sleeping right below that room made my heart race, even though I tried to shake it off. I hadn't been there long before I first heard the footsteps. The night was eerily still, the kind of quiet that made everything feel louder than it should be. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. The moonlight crept through the curtains, casting long, dark shadows in the corners of the room. I was wide awake, my mind racing with random thoughts, when I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. It started on the far side of the room, the side closest to the window. Slow, deliberate steps. It sounded like someone walking, but with no real hurry. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. The steps kept coming, getting closer, and I could feel the hair on my neck standing on end. I didn't even want to move, too scared to make a sound, to even breathe too loudly. The footsteps came closer, closer still, until they passed right above me, right over my head, moving toward the far side of the room. I felt a chill settle over me, a gnawing, suffocating fear creeping into my bones. The footsteps stopped. There was no more sound. Nothing. Silence. I could barely bring myself to breathe. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't lie there anymore. I bolted out of bed, my heart racing in my chest, and I went to my grandpa's room. I knocked softly at the door, not wanting to wake him, but too scared to stay in my own room. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Grandpa, I heard something. Someone's upstairs." He didn't seem alarmed, just rolled over and muttered about the house being old. He told me the creaks and groans were normal, that it was just the house settling. I didn't feel convinced, but Grandpa was the one who lived there. He turned the light on in the dining room, then went back to sleep. I still couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had taken hold of me, but I went back to my room. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling, but then it started again. Thump, thump, thump. From the other side of the room, the exact same pace. The footsteps passed over me again, moving from one side to the other. When they reached the end of the room, they stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe I had imagined it. But then I heard it. The sound that made my blood run cold. The stairs creaked. One step, 2, 3, 4. It sounded like someone was coming down. Slowly. No hurry. Just one step after another. The noise was too real to ignore. Too loud to pretend it wasn't happening. The footsteps continued, getting closer to the landing. Each creak, each step was as distinct as if it was happening right in front of me. By the time it reached the bottom of the stairs, I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't even move. I was too terrified to do anything, too terrified to even scream. The footsteps didn't stop at the bottom of the stairs. They continued across the floor, coming closer to my room. I could hear the footsteps in my room now. The weight of each step seemed to make the floorboards groan. I lay frozen under the covers, staring at the doorway, the dim light from the dining room spilling into the room. My vision started to blur, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the fear crept in. I couldn't escape it. It was closing in on me. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to block out the sound, but then I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. Scratching, soft but distinct, scratching against wood. It was coming from the direction of Grandpa's gun case. I knew that sound, the sound of claws or nails scratching against the wood. Long, slow scrapes that sent chills crawling down my spine. I could hear it with agonizing clarity, each scratch getting louder as it dragged down the wood. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. I couldn't scream. My throat was tight, my body too tense, too frozen. I could only lie there, trembling, listening to the horrible sound. I felt my body shaking, my heart pounding faster than ever. I could hear the wood of the gun case tapping against its frame with every new scratch. Whoever, or whatever, was making that sound was so close. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed. I screamed as loudly as I could, the sound raw in my throat. My grandpa was in the room seconds later, his face pale as he switched on the light. I was beyond words, beyond explanation. I could barely even look at him. He didn't believe me, of course. He said it was just the house. It was always the house. But that night, I didn't care. I wasn't about to stay in that room another second longer. The rest of the night, I draped a sheet over the side of my bed, tucked myself under the comforter, and turned my back to the door. I didn't dare look back. I put on my headphones and prayed I'd fall asleep. I didn't want to know what was on the other side of that room, what might still be waiting. The next morning, Grandpa told Grandma what had happened. She didn't seem bothered. "That's silly," she said, brushing it off. "Your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here. She came in, saying she heard footsteps. That did nothing to ease the tight knot in my stomach. If anything, it made things worse. The idea that someone else had heard it too only deepened the sense of unease. I slept under the bed for the rest of my stay. I could barely bring myself to leave that space, to face the room above. Even when I was older, even when I was 23, the fear never fully went away. Every time I stayed at my grandparents' house, I heard the footsteps. Every single time. I sleep on top of the bed now, but I still keep my back to the door. I still wear headphones to block out the noise. And though I haven't heard anything come down the stairs since that first night, I know that it's only a matter of time before it starts again. And when it does, I don't want to know. When I was in high school, I had a friend who lived next door to a house that had always been up for sale. The house was strange in a way that was hard to explain. It wasn't that it was old or run down, although it definitely had that tired look, the kind you get when no one lives in a house for a while. But there was something else about it. People would move in, but they never seemed to last. It was like the place had a curse or a magnet for people who just couldn't handle it. They'd move in and then be gone within a few months, sometimes in the middle of the night, without even telling anyone. The house had never had the same owner for more than 6 months in the last few years. It wasn't a big deal at first, but after a while, the mystery of it all became unsettling. My friend, Sam, and I talked about it sometimes. He lived in a house just like it next door, also built in the 1950s, so we kind of understood the charm of an old house in a nice part of town. But the constant turnover at the house next door made it seem like something wasn't right. It wasn't like other houses around the area. One Friday night in December, when we were really bored, Sam brought it up again. He said, "Why don't we go check out the house? It's been empty for a while, hasn't it?" I should have known better, but I didn't. We were restless, and the idea of sneaking into a house that everyone avoided felt thrilling. The thought of exploring something that had so many unanswered questions about it, it sounded like the perfect way to waste a night. We decided to go around the back of the house, figuring no one would be around. The backyard was enclosed with a tall, wooden fence that had seen better days, but it still offered enough cover. Sam knew the house better than I did, having lived next door for so long, so he led the way. He pointed to a small dog door on the side of the house, just below a window. It wasn't locked or anything, just a little flap of metal. Sam said he could crawl through it. "Let's see what's inside," he said with a mischievous grin. I followed him, feeling the cold air on my face as he worked the latch on the back door and pulled it open. It creaked loudly, like the house hadn't been used in years. The smell of dust and stale air hit me immediately as I stepped inside, the faint mustiness of a house that had been abandoned for too long. I remember feeling that weird mix of curiosity and unease, but it wasn't enough to stop me. We were there now, so we might as well check it out. The house looked completely normal on the inside, but in a way that only old houses can feel normal. It was like stepping into someone's past, where everything seemed familiar but a little faded. The floors creaked under our feet as we made our way through the living room, past a fireplace that had clearly never been used, and into the kitchen. The kitchen had a built-in breakfast nook that sat right up against a picture window. It was a nice touch, the kind of feature you don't see anymore, and it overlooked the backyard. From here, you could see the street light flickering through the window, casting a dim glow on everything. The electricity was off, of course. The whole house had that kind of stillness about it, like it hadn't felt the warmth of a living person in years. But outside, the street light made the room look oddly comforting. Sam and I sat down at the breakfast table, just on the floor, leaning against the edge of the old wooden seats. I remember thinking that this was strange, but not exactly scary. We were just hanging out, talking. We were laughing at something, some random thing that we had come up with, but everything felt off. Like we were too old to be doing this, sneaking into a house that no one wanted. Maybe it was just the atmosphere, the air in that house that made me uncomfortable. There was a weird tension in the silence, but I chalked it up to nerves. Suddenly, Sam screamed. It wasn't a normal scream, either. It was this high-pitched, frantic kind of scream that immediately made me freeze. I didn't even have time to process it. Before I could look around, everything went black. And I don't mean I couldn't see, I mean my entire vision went completely dark, like someone turned out the lights in the middle of the day. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the cold. I felt it first, creeping over my skin, starting at my feet and moving up my legs. This wasn't the kind of cold that you feel when you step outside on a winter day. It wasn't just cold, it was this sickly, oppressive chill that felt like it was inside my bones. It was as if the cold had come from somewhere deeper than the house, somewhere wrong, and it wrapped itself around me until I couldn't feel anything else. My body was frozen, but not in the way that I could just shiver and shrug it off. No, this was something that reached deep inside me, taking over my muscles and making me feel numb and paralyzed. I started screaming too, trying to get away from it, but my body wouldn't move. I could hear my voice echoing through the house, distant and panicked, but it felt muffled, like I was underwater. Then, I felt a hand grab mine, pulling me hard, forcing me to move. It was Sam. His grip was strong, frantic, and I could feel his fingers digging into my skin as he dragged me somewhere. I couldn't see him. Everything was still pitch black, and I was still trapped in that suffocating cold, but I could feel him pulling me in a direction. Then, all of a sudden, I was outside. I didn't know how I got there, but I was outside under the streetlight, gasping for air. The cold was gone, and I could feel the night air on my skin, cool, but not nearly as cold as the house had been. It was December, and it should have been much colder outside, but it wasn't. I shivered anyway, not from the cold, but from the fear and confusion flooding my brain. I looked around, trying to piece things together, and that's when I saw Sam. He looked scared. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something I couldn't name, and his breath came in quick, shallow bursts. He wasn't the Sam I'd seen just minutes ago, the one laughing and joking. "Sam," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. I couldn't understand what had just happened. What was that? He didn't speak right away. He was shaking, like he couldn't control it. After a long pause, he said, You were sitting there, and you were talking, and then something crawled out from under the table. It was all black like a shadow, but it had the shape of a girl. It crawled up to you, and you just froze. You started groping around like you couldn't see, and your eyes were wide open, but you weren't looking at anything. I couldn't stand it. I thought you were going to, I don't know, I thought you were going to. He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. I couldn't shake the feeling of that coldness, not for days. Every time I tried to sleep, I would feel that chill creeping up my spine, that sensation that something was still in the room with me. Even after Sam and I stopped talking about it, even when we joked and laughed like everything was normal, I couldn't walk past that house again. It was always there, that unsettling feeling like something was watching me, waiting for me to come back. But I never did. And to this day, I still can't explain what happened. Was it just a trick of the mind? Something that Sam and I imagined together? Maybe, but it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like a dream or a hallucination. It felt too real, too tangible. The house has been empty again, but this time, no one even tries to sell it. It just sits there, gathering dust and growing older. And when I walk past it, I feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It's not just because of the memories. It's because something happened in that house. Something that didn't leave when we walked out. It's still there waiting. My mother told me this story not too long ago, but it happened about 10 years ago. I remember it like it was yesterday because, despite how many years had passed, it still gives me chills. What makes it even more unsettling is that it happened in our own family, to people we knew and loved. It all began with my cousin, a girl about 17 or 18 years old at the time. Her name was Emily. She wasn't just a cousin to me. She was more like a close friend. Growing up, she had always been the one to organize family get-togethers, and her laugh had a way of making the room feel warmer. She was bubbly, friendly, and just one of those people everyone around her could count on. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks after her birthday, everything changed. Emily had been in a car crash. It wasn't a huge crash or a dramatic one, but it was enough. She was in the hospital for a few days. At first, doctors were hopeful, saying she might pull through, but it quickly became clear that she wasn't going to make it. We all held on to hope, of course, but after a few days, she passed away. I remember how heavy that day felt. My aunt, her mother, was beyond devastated, as you can imagine. She'd lost her firstborn child. It broke the hearts of everyone in the family, and Emily's younger siblings, who were still small, didn't really understand what had happened. They just kept asking where Emily was, and my aunt had to explain over and over again that Emily wasn't coming back. Now, before Emily had passed away, my aunt and uncle were having a house built. They had recently bought an old plot of land on the outskirts of town, a quiet place where the noise of traffic and people wouldn't bother them. It was perfect, or at least it seemed perfect. The house was still under construction at the time of Emily's death, and my aunt had planned on moving in once the work was finished. But after everything happened, the house just sat there for a while, with only the skeleton of a home standing, half finished. My aunt couldn't bring herself to go to the construction site at first. She was grieving, and everything about the house just felt like a reminder of the life she'd hoped to have with her daughter. It wasn't until a couple of weeks after Emily's passing that my aunt went back to check on the progress of the house. And that's when things started to get really strange. The workers at the site started calling my aunt. They were friendly enough, but there was a noticeable nervousness in their voices. At first, my aunt thought they were just calling about the usual issues with the construction, delays, materials, things like that. But the conversation quickly took a strange turn. One of the workers said there was something he needed to tell her. It sounded like a complaint, and my aunt braced herself for what it might be. "There's a girl who keeps showing up at the site," the worker told her. "She's been walking around the house for the past couple of weeks. It's been happening almost every day now. We've tried talking to her, but she doesn't respond. She just walks around, looking at things, then leaves." My aunt, not sure what to make of it, asked for more details. She figured maybe it was just a local kid wandering around the site out of curiosity. The worker described the girl in detail. Long brown hair, a red baseball cap, denim dungarees, and a white jacket. The description didn't immediately ring any bells for my aunt, but there was something about it that felt off. The worker said that the girl seemed to show up at odd times, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, but she always seemed to appear and disappear without anyone really seeing her leave. My aunt's curiosity turned to concern. Was it someone from the neighborhood? She asked the worker to describe her in more detail to see if anyone around the area might know her. As the worker gave more specific details, it became clear to my aunt who the girl might be. He described her the way you might remember a friend or family member. Those familiar details that come without thinking. The girl had long brown hair, always tied up in a simple ponytail or under that red baseball cap, always dressed in the same outfit. My aunt's heart began to race as she realized the description was too specific. It was Emily, my cousin, but that couldn't be right. Emily had passed away just a couple of weeks before. How could it possibly be her? At first, my aunt refused to believe it. She tried to brush it off as a coincidence, as if someone else from the neighborhood happened to dress just like Emily. But the more she thought about it, the more unsettling it became. She asked the worker to describe the girl again, just to be sure, and it was the same details. Long brown hair, red cap, denim dungarees, and a white jacket. It wasn't just one worker either. Several of them had seen this girl wandering around the site. One worker said he had tried to speak with her, but she ignored him and just kept walking. Another said she'd waved at him before turning around and walking off. as though she didn't have a care in the world. No one thought to question it too much at first. It was a construction site, after all, and there were often people who would wander by or take shortcuts through the area. But it wasn't normal to see a teenage girl just showing up and walking around the site day after day. When my aunt returned home that evening, she took out an old photo album and showed the workers a picture of Emily. She asked them if the girl they'd seen looked anything like the girl in the picture. Without hesitation, they all agreed that it was her. They said it was the same girl they had seen on the construction site, exactly how they remembered her. It was then that my aunt felt a coldness settle over her. She didn't know what to make of it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She told my mother about the incident, and at first, my mother tried to explain it away, thinking it might have been some kind of mistake or mix-up. But as the days went by, more workers reported seeing the girl, and my aunt became more and more unsettled. A week later, my aunt decided to visit the construction site herself. She drove out to the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She was nervous, not sure what she expected to find. Maybe she was just hoping it was all some strange coincidence. But as she walked around the site, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She looked around, half expecting to see Emily standing there, looking at her. But the site was empty, just as it had been when she arrived. The workers didn't know what to say anymore. They had all seen the girl. They had all described her the same way. And they had all agreed that it was Emily. There was no denying it. But as the days turned into weeks, something else happened. The sightings of the girl began to stop. The workers stopped reporting seeing her, and my aunt stopped visiting the site. The house, though still under construction, was left largely untouched for a while. My aunt, at this point, had no explanation for what had happened, and neither did anyone else. A few months later, the house was finally finished, but the atmosphere had changed. My aunt never seemed to be able to enjoy it fully. There was a lingering sadness in the air. It was as though the house was haunted not by any ghost, but by a memory that couldn't quite let go. The workers had seen Emily, or someone who looked like her, walking around the site, but no one could explain it. And to this day, no one has an answer. I remember thinking about it a lot after my mother told me the story. I thought maybe it was just the mind playing tricks on people, especially in a time of grief. But after hearing it, I began to realize that there are some things we just can't explain. My family wasn't the type to believe in paranormal things. We were practical people, and the idea of anything beyond the natural world didn't sit well with us. But that didn't change the fact that Emily had died, and that the workers had seen someone who looked just like her. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was something else. But one thing is for sure, the house never felt quite the same after that. It was as if something had lingered in the air, an unspoken reminder of a time that was gone, but not forgotten. The workers saw her. My aunt saw her. And for me, that will always be the most unsettling thing of all. Years later, the house became a home. My aunt eventually moved in with her family. It's a beautiful place now, full of life, laughter, and memories. But every now and then, when I pass by it, I think of that time and wonder if Emily is still there, walking around the site, still watching over the family she left behind. There's no way to know for sure, but there's one thing I can't shake. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the house, I feel like someone is watching me, and I wonder if it's Emily. I was 17 years old. I had just moved to the city, a naive, wide-eyed country girl in the middle of a busy, unfamiliar place. College had been both an exciting and overwhelming experience, and I was still getting used to the crowds, the noises, the endless lights, and the feeling of being small in such a big world. I remember that night like it was yesterday. The streets felt different, darker somehow, and it was late, around 1:30 in the morning. The city was still buzzing, but everything was more muted, almost eerie. Most students were either asleep or out partying. I wasn't out partying. I wasn't out to meet anyone. I was just walking. I'd missed the bus back to my dorm after visiting a friend, and for some reason, I had decided I could just walk back. I wasn't familiar with the city, but I thought I knew the basics. I had a map, right? I could totally make it. My dorm was only a few miles away. What could possibly go wrong? I don't even know why I walked that night. It felt like the right choice at the time, though I've replayed it in my head 1,000 times since then, trying to figure out what the hell I was thinking. I'd been so used to the wide open spaces back home. There, you could hear the crickets, see the stars, and walk at night without a care in the world. But the city? The city was different. The streets were lined with rows of old, broken houses. The sound of car engines echoed too loudly, and I couldn't see past the few lights that flickered in and out along the sidewalks. It was late, and the neighborhood I was walking through, let's just say it wasn't a place you'd want to be in the dark, no matter what time it was. I didn't realize I was heading into the worst part of town at first. I think I was just too proud to admit that I was lost. It felt like every street looked the same, each one darker than the last. The few people out that night walked quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. I told myself that I'd be fine. But that night, fine was a long way off. It wasn't until I heard the car that I really started to panic. I could feel it before I even saw it. Something about the way the headlights reflected off the trash and the broken pavement. I looked over my shoulder, and there it was, creeping slowly behind me. The car kept pace with my steps for an entire block. It was a beat-up sedan, old, gray, rusted. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside, but the feeling in my gut was all wrong. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just going the same way. But when I reached the intersection up ahead, they made a sharp left and pulled right into my path, blocking the street. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. There were 5 guys in that car. They were loud, talking to each other in low voices. I was frozen. I couldn't think. The words I wanted to scream didn't come out. My whole body went numb. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it was bad. The car stayed in the middle of the street, the engine running, while the guys inside were just sitting there staring at me. I felt the tension in the air, like something was about to break. For a few seconds, maybe more, maybe less, I just stood there. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't run because I knew they would catch me before I'd even made a block. I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't strong enough. The street was silent except for the low hum of the car's engine and the distant sounds of shouting coming from the houses. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I just wanted to make everything stop. And then, out of nowhere, something unexpected happened. A porch light clicked on from the house just past where the car had stopped. At first, I thought it was just the light from another street lamp or maybe a neighbor trying to turn on a light. But no, this light was different. A man casually walked out the front door, a trash bag in his hand, not a care in the world. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but he was clearly there. I watched him, almost unable to believe what I was seeing. The man threw the trash bag into the bin, and that's when the car, without any warning, revved its engine and peeled away, tires screeching on the pavement. I don't know why they left. Maybe they were spooked by the guy walking out of the house. Maybe they didn't want to risk being seen. Whatever the reason, they drove off, leaving me standing in the middle of the street, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do. I was in shock. My legs were weak, and my chest felt like it was caving in. I finally managed to take a few shaky steps off the street, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. My breathing was shallow, my vision blurred. I could feel tears welling up, but I didn't want to cry right then, not like that. I didn't want to break down in the middle of the street, but I couldn't help it. The man who had come out of the house noticed me right away. He looked at me, then at the direction the car had gone, and then back at me. His expression was one of concern, maybe confusion, but there was no hesitation. He walked over to me slowly, his eyes softening as he approached. "Hey, you okay?" he asked. His voice was steady, calm, like he dealt with this kind of thing all the time. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even form words. I just nodded, still trying to steady my breath, wiping my eyes quickly. "You look like you need to sit down," he said, looking at me with a kind but firm expression. He led me inside his house before I could protest. I wasn't sure what else to do. It felt like a strange kind of safety inside there, even though everything about it felt so surreal. The guy gave me a soda, which I barely drank. My hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. He listened as I rambled about what had happened, though I'm sure I was barely making sense. He nodded through my stuttering, telling me it was okay, that I wasn't alone. His roommate came in a few minutes later, and I think he had some idea of what was going on too. They were both so kind to me, neither of them asking any weird questions or making me feel uncomfortable. They didn't judge, they just listened. Eventually, after I calmed down a bit, they offered to walk me back to my dorm. I was so embarrassed, but they didn't seem to mind. I could barely remember the details of what I'd just gone through, but I was so thankful to these strangers for showing me the kind of kindness in the middle of something so terrifying. As we walked through the dark streets, the city felt different, less suffocating, less dangerous. The streetlights seemed to shine brighter now. We made small talk, though my mind kept drifting back to that car, to those men, to the way my heart had nearly stopped when I thought I was going to disappear into that night. When we reached my dorm, I said my thanks, though it didn't feel like enough. The guy smiled and mentioned they did stand-up comedy on the side. He invited me to come check out one of their shows sometime, though I never took him up on it. I was still too young to get into the bar where they performed, and besides, I just wanted to get into my room and lock the door. I never saw those guys again. I couldn't even remember their names, but I'm sure I wouldn't have forgotten them if it wasn't for how that night turned out. I'll never forget that guy taking the trash out at the right moment. If he hadn't stepped outside when he did, I'm not sure I'd be here today telling this story. I still think about what might have happened if he hadn't been there. And I think about how easily I could have been another statistic in a city that was too big for someone like me to understand. I know it was stupid. It was reckless. And I was lucky, so damn lucky, that someone decided to do something good that night. Now, when I think back on that moment, I don't focus on the fear anymore. I focus on the hero who was just taking out his trash when he saved me. He'll never know what a difference he made, and honestly, I'm not sure if I'll ever have the words to explain it to him if I ever did see him again. But I'm here, safe and sound, and that's something I'll never forget. I've always heard my grandmother swear by this story, and no matter how many times I asked, she'd never change the details. She'd tell it as if it happened just yesterday, even though she passed away a few years ago. It was one of those stories that had its own place in the family's lore. Her voice would always drop a little lower, and she'd give you that knowing look as if she'd witnessed something so out of the ordinary that it changed her life. And no matter how you felt about things like ghosts or fate or just plain bad luck, you couldn't deny the weight of it when she spoke. It took place during the war, during the Blitz, when the bombs were falling like rain over London. My dad was just a baby at the time, and my grandmother, who I knew to be tough as nails, was living through what most people today would call a nightmare. She had her own house, of course, but it didn't take long before the bombs came, and she was forced to move in with a friend of hers who lived just a few streets away. A bomb had struck close enough to make her home unlivable, and so she and my dad went to stay with this woman. The house wasn't much, but it was safer than being out in the open, and it was better than the alternative. That's how it was for most of the people back then. Survival was the goal, not comfort. My grandmother had always been fiercely protective of my dad, and even though he was only a baby, she made sure to keep him close, especially at night. She'd tuck him in and sit by his cot, her mind racing with the sounds of distant explosions and the ever-present threat of more bombs. People were on edge, and the air always seemed to hum with the tension of the unknown. But that night was different. She swore that it was the most unsettling night of her life. The house she was staying in had been an old building with creaky wooden floors and narrow staircases that wound up to the second floor, which was where she was staying with her baby. The top floor was where they had set up a room for her, away from the worst of the noise, and where she could keep an eye on my dad. But that night, as she climbed the stairs, something fell off. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and the usual sounds of war, distant explosions, the occasional air raid siren, seemed muffled, as though they were being blocked out by some strange pressure in the air. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it was as if something was telling her to stop, to turn around and leave. She just made it to the stairs, holding my dad in her arms when it happened. The stairs creaked beneath her feet, and as she glanced upward, she swore she saw something, or maybe someone, standing at the top of the stairs. It wasn't quite a figure, but it was there, some sort of presence that made her blood run cold. It wasn't a person, not really, but it had the shape of one, like it had been pulled together from the shadows themselves. It was as though the air thickened and a figure took shape just for a moment, standing at the top of the stairs. She didn't know what to make of it at first. She couldn't explain it, but it wasn't the sort of thing you ignored, not when you were already living through the hell of a war. She stood frozen for what felt like forever, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at this strange, shifting mass at the top of the stairs. Then, clear as day, a voice came from it, soft but commanding. It wasn't like anything she'd ever heard before. It wasn't a whisper, but it wasn't loud either. It was like a cold wind blowing through the cracks in the house. The voice told her, quite simply, not to sleep in that room tonight. That's when something inside her snapped. She didn't wait for anything more. She didn't ask any questions or try to reason with it. She didn't even wait to see what would happen next. She turned, clutching my dad to her chest, and started heading back down the stairs as fast as she could. She didn't look back. She just got out of there. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she went straight to her friend and told her that she and my dad were sleeping in the sitting room that night, and that she wasn't going back up there. The friend, understandably, was a little annoyed. She told my grandmother that she was being paranoid, that she couldn't keep running from every little thing that scared her. But my grandmother was firm, and she refused to go back up to the room. After a little back and forth, her friend reluctantly agreed, though she made it clear she thought my grandmother was overreacting. That night, they both bedded down in the sitting room, my grandmother on a small couch, my dad in his cot beside her. The sounds of war were all around them, but for that night, the house seemed to settle into a strange kind of quiet. The distant rumble of bombers and the occasional sound of air raid sirens faded into the background. It was almost peaceful in a way, but that peace didn't last. Sometime in the dead of night, when they were all trying to sleep, a bomb hit. It was close, too close. The house shook violently, and for a moment, my grandmother thought the whole thing might collapse. The walls groaned, and the ceiling above them seemed to buckle. Dust filled the air, and my grandmother instinctively shielded my dad, clutching him tighter to her chest as the house seemed to tremble with the force of the blast. Then, the roof above the room where she had been supposed to sleep caved in. It came down with a deafening crash, the weight of it breaking through the walls and floors like they were nothing. The cot where my dad would have been sleeping was crushed under the debris. Had they been upstairs, had they ignored that warning and stayed in that room, my dad would have been right under the rubble. As it was, the sitting room they'd chosen to sleep in was far enough from the blast zone that they were unharmed. My grandmother sat there, stunned, still clutching my dad in her arms. She could hardly believe what had just happened, and when she realized the gravity of it, the weight of the situation hit her all at once. If she hadn't listened, if she hadn't gotten that warning, she and my dad would have been caught in the collapse of the house. That would have been it. She would have lost everything. The strange figure, the voice on the stairs, had saved them. But in a way, it also terrified her. It made her question everything. Was it some kind of instinct? Was it fate? Or was it something else entirely? For the rest of her life, my grandmother swore by that story. She would tell it over and over again every time someone asked her about her experiences during the war, and every time she told it, you could see the same awe and fear in her eyes. She never once doubted what had happened. Not once did she question the message she'd received. It had saved her son's life, and she would never forget it. Years later, when I would ask her about it, she'd tell me with the same conviction she had the first time. She'd always end the story the same way, with that same clear message: trust your instincts. Trust the warnings, even if you don't understand them. Because sometimes, those warnings are the only things standing between you and something far worse. And in the end, my grandmother lived a long life. She saw my dad grow up, have children of his own. She saw the world change, but she never forgot the lesson that night taught her. Trust yourself. Trust your gut. Because sometimes, it's the only thing keeping you alive. It had been a week since I got my CPR certification, and the truth was I didn't expect it to be put to use anytime soon. I had gotten certified more out of curiosity than anything else. I didn't think I would ever need it. But that Saturday afternoon, while I was just out shopping with a few friends, the knowledge came back to me in the most horrifying way. We had been browsing a thrift store, sorting through old Halloween costumes. I was with two friends, and we were mostly having fun, trying on silly wigs and over-the-top costumes. The kind of thing you do when you're just looking to kill some time. Then, everything went eerily quiet. I was in the back of the store, trying on a ridiculous vampire cape in the dressing room, when I heard the muffled sounds of commotion outside. A few minutes later, someone burst through the door. They were flustered, their face pale, and their voice shaky. There's someone passed out in the parking lot. Someone needs to help them. I froze for a second. My heart started to pound. I knew what this situation could be. I'd heard about it before, but I never imagined I would actually have to face it. I'm certified in CPR, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know why I said it like that, as if saying it aloud would make it more real, but it did. The woman looked at me, wide-eyed, nodding. "You should go quick," she said, as others began pulling out their phones to call 911. I ran out of the dressing room, my pulse racing now. The store seemed quieter than usual, the air too still. My friends were standing near the door, looking unsure of what to do. I waved them off and headed for the exit. The chill outside hit me immediately. It wasn't cold, but there was something about it, something that made everything feel off. I looked around the parking lot. At first, I didn't see anything. No one on the ground, no obvious signs of trouble. Just rows of cars parked, the faint sound of traffic in the distance. I could hear my own breath in the silence. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw someone moving toward me. A man, pointing toward a car that was parked far from the others. "She's in there," he said urgently, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't need to be told twice. I broke into a sprint toward the car, not even caring if I was being reckless. This was it. This was real. As I got closer, my heart sank. The car was empty, but there she was, slumped against the window, her face completely blue, a lifeless shell of a person. Her features were hard to make out, but the pallor of her skin told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't breathing. She was gone. I don't even remember opening the door, but I did. I slid into the car, my hands shaking as I reached for her. Her eyes were half closed, but the look in them was terrifying, like she was still fighting for life, but already too far gone. There was a smell too, faint but pungent, an awful chemical stench that made my stomach churn. I didn't know what to do first. The weight of the situation hit me hard, but I snapped back to reality when I realized that she still had a faint pulse. It was weak, though, and barely detectable. I wasn't sure if it was even a pulse or just my own panic playing tricks on me. "Call 911! Call 911!" I shouted as I turned to the others who had gathered around. The urgency in my voice made them scramble for their phones. I didn't know why they hadn't already called them. Maybe they were frozen, unsure. Maybe they didn't know what to do. Maybe they thought she was already dead. But I did know one thing. I had to act fast. We pulled her from the car, her limp body feeling like it weighed a ton as we carefully laid her on the cold asphalt. It was like she didn't even have bones anymore, like her body had been drained of everything that made her human. I took a deep breath. I could hear my own breath now, shallow and fast. My hands were shaking. I'd been trained, but there was nothing that could prepare me for this. I moved into position, placing my hands on her chest as I had been taught. I didn't waste any time. I pressed down hard, my arms aching from the effort, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I wasn't going to let her die here in front of me. Not when there was a chance. Not when I knew what I had to do. I counted the compressions. 1, 2, 3, 10. The others were hovering around, not sure what to do. The sirens were getting louder, but time seemed to stretch, like the whole world had slowed down. By the time the ambulance arrived, I was sweating and exhausted, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My hands were slipping on the slick surface of her chest, but I kept going. The paramedics rushed out of the truck, already pulling equipment from the back as they moved toward us. "Step back, we've got this," one of them said, gently pulling me away. But I didn't move far. I couldn't. I watched them work quickly, placing her on the stretcher and starting their own rounds of CPR. The woman's face was still blue, her skin cold and stiff, but they didn't give up. I stood there in a daze, my hands still tingling from the pressure of the compressions, still shaking. The world felt muted, like I was observing everything from a distance. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a finality that made my chest tighten. Another ambulance pulled in, and more paramedics flooded the scene. There were at least 6 of them now, all gathered around her, all working furiously. I couldn't stop staring. I wanted to believe she could make it. But the truth was, I didn't think she would. One of the officers came over, his face grim. "We administered Narcan," he said. "It's a drug that can reverse heroin overdoses if given in time, but she's already pretty far gone." His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw the sorrow in them. It was like he knew she wouldn't make it either. They strapped her in and drove away with sirens blaring, leaving us standing in the lot, surrounded by a heavy silence that felt suffocating. The others who had gathered around slowly began to disperse, most of them still in shock. A few were talking quietly, their voices hushed as if they weren't sure if they had witnessed something that was real. I took a deep breath and looked down. That's when I noticed the empty pill bottles scattered on the floor of the car, the used heroin needles, the unmistakable signs of someone who had been living in the throes of addiction. It was like a punch to the gut. She couldn't have been much older than me, maybe late 20s, early 30s at the most. The tattoos on her arms were the only thing that told me who she might have been. 2 names inked into her skin. I didn't recognize them, but they felt important. Maybe they were her kids' names. I glanced over and saw a car seat, a few toys scattered on the floor. It felt wrong, so wrong to think of children, maybe hers, maybe someone else's, being involved in this. Her life wasn't just hers. It never was. The thought stuck with me for the rest of the day. We all went back inside, the air inside the store feeling even more sterile than before. I couldn't shake the image of her face. The blue color, the tears still clinging to her cheeks when I first saw her, the faint pulse I'd felt that had given me hope. By the time I left the store and walked to my car, I could barely think straight. The whole thing had happened so fast, yet it felt like it had dragged on forever. It was a blur of noise and movement, but in that blur, there was nothing I could do to save her. I found out later that she didn't make it. I don't know how, but somehow I wasn't surprised. The officers had been right. She was already gone when I got to her. Her body, her spirit, everything about her had already left before I even knew she existed. It was just a matter of time. That night, I thought a lot about her, about the life she had lived, about the kids, if they were hers. It was haunting, the way everything had unfolded. I didn't know her, but in that moment, I had tried to save her, and it hurt more than I could explain. The only thing I could do was keep moving forward, knowing that I had done everything I could. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd failed her. I remember the morning like it was yesterday. It was one of those early, misty hours when the world feels half asleep, like it's not sure whether to wake up or keep dreaming. The kind of morning where the air is thick with fog, the streets barely lit, and the only sounds are distant cars and the soft shuffle of footsteps. I was on my way to the bus stop, just another regular morning, with my mind foggy from the lack of sleep and my stomach growling in that early morning emptiness. I was eating a banana, tried to get a bit of energy before my commute. It was 5 a.m. I had no reason to think anything out of the ordinary was going to happen that day. I remember thinking, as I ate the banana, that I still hadn't decided if I should grab my daily Starbucks before or after the bus ride. Such a small, pointless thing to be debating, but in that moment, it was the only thing my brain could focus on. I was wrapped up in the trivial thoughts of the day ahead. My hands still smelling faintly of banana, my mind drifting between the future and the past. As I approached the corner of my street, where the light barely reached, I saw a shadow in the alley. It didn't stand out at first, just another shape in the dark. My brain didn't really register it as anything unusual. But then as I got closer, the figure stepped out from the shadows. He was tall, wearing a black mask that covered everything except his eyes. In that moment, my sleepy brain couldn't quite catch up with the reality of what was happening. I didn't even think to feel scared at first. I was too tired, too confused to process it. Then he shouted, and everything clicked. "Put down your fucking purse." The words were sharp, urgent. My heart leapt in my chest, the blood draining from my face in an instant. I froze for a second, thinking, did I hear that right? He was pointing a gun at me. It was a simple, black handgun, held with an unsteady hand, but the barrel was steady, aimed directly at my head. The world narrowed in on that gun, the noise around me suddenly muted by the thumping of my own heartbeat. "Put down your bags," he ordered, the gun never wavering. My hands were still full from the banana, sticky with the remnants of it. I could barely process what was happening, but my body was already reacting, moving without my mind catching up. I felt a wave of cold panic, but also an odd, calm resolve. Okay, I'm putting them down over here," I said, trying to sound cooperative, my voice shaking, but trying not to show fear. My bags were heavy, but I didn't hesitate to set them down on the ground. "Walk over here, toward me. Get down on the fucking ground," he ordered again, his voice full of impatience. Okay, I'm coming," I said, trying to sound like I was in control, even though I wasn't. My breath was coming fast, and I could feel my pulse racing, the adrenaline creeping up my spine. I knew, instinctively, that I needed to get away, but something kept me frozen. As I started moving towards him, I noticed that his mask wasn't perfectly fitted, and I could catch glimpses of his skin under it. His eyes were frantic, darting around nervously, as if he wasn't sure what to do next. I could feel his desperation, his uncertainty, and I wondered for a second if he had done this before. I felt my stomach drop as a realization hit me. This man had no idea what he was doing. I continued moving, my thoughts racing. The words fell from my lips without thought. "Look, see, I'm on the ground. My stuff is over there. Please just take my stuff." But he didn't like that. His anger flared instantly. "Shut the fuck up, okay." He grabbed me roughly by the arm and shoved me to the ground. His knee dug into my back as he pressed the gun to my head. My mind was spinning, my heart slamming against my ribs. Everything I knew about the world seemed to fade away. All I could focus on was the pressure of the gun against my skull and the harshness of his breath against my ear. I couldn't think clearly. My body was on autopilot, the instinct to survive kicking in. He hovered over me for what felt like an eternity, the world spinning around us in the thick mist. I could feel his body heat against my back, his breath hot and fast against my neck. The weight of his knee dug into me, and I tried to suppress the urge to cry out. But in that moment, I remember thinking clearly about something I had never really thought about before. The fact that I was dressed like a guy. I'd worn baggy pants, a loose jacket, and a hat, and had pulled the whole look together with a slouchy, relaxed style that made me blend in, made me feel safe. In the dark of the early morning, in my disoriented state, I hadn't thought about how I might appear to someone else. I was just someone out on an early morning walk. But as he pressed down on me, I realized that it wasn't just about the purse. He'd seen me, but he hadn't seen me. Not at first. Then, something strange happened. The man paused. His hand, still gripping my arm, loosened just slightly. For a second, the gun wavered, and I could feel his gaze linger on me, sharper now. It was like a switch flipped in his head, and then it clicked. He realized I was a woman. It wasn't like some sudden moment of clarity, but something changed in his body language. It was as if he recognized me not as just a target, but as someone with different value, someone who was a threat, or maybe someone he thought he could control. His posture shifted. The pressure against my back lessened. The gun stayed in my head, but there was something different in his expression now. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and demanding. I felt my stomach churn. I knew what this was. I knew where he wanted to take me. There had been a series of assaults in my neighborhood, recently daylight attacks on women, and I had heard the details. I knew the stories. My body went cold as my mind screamed at me not to follow him down that dark alley. I had no idea what would happen to me if I went there, but I knew it would be bad. I took a deep breath, and in that split second, my mind screamed at me, "Asterisk, this is it. You can't go down there. Fight. Fight with everything you have, asterisk." But another part of me, fear, maybe, whispered that I had no choice. He had a gun. He could end it in a second. "Fucking follow me," he shouted again, more urgently. Something inside me snapped. I don't know what happened, but I suddenly stopped thinking. I couldn't go down that alley, not without a fight. I didn't care if he had a gun. I started talking again, my voice trying to sound calm, even though my heart was pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. "I'm coming. I'm following you." I called, my words tentative but quick. He bought it. I saw it in his eyes. He relaxed just enough. I could see him turning his body slightly, just enough for me to get a tiny window. Without a second thought, I stepped backward, tiny movements just a few inches at a time. I didn't wait for him to react. I didn't look back. I just took those few small steps, and then, without thinking, my legs moved faster. I didn't even hear myself scream until I was already halfway down the street, running as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. I knew he was still there, but I didn't care. I was running now. I heard my own voice in the distance, high and frantic, echoing in my ears as I sprinted through the fog, away from him. I ran 6-7 blocks, my lungs burning, my legs screaming with the effort. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let him know where I lived. I had no idea how far behind me he was. Eventually, I turned a corner, ducked into a side street, and just kept running. My brain couldn't process what had just happened. My whole body was on fire with adrenaline. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I locked the door behind me, my hands still shaking from the run. I remember sitting on the floor of my living room, my back against the door, and just breathing, trying to calm myself down. The quiet of the apartment felt too loud. I waited for what seemed like hours, not daring to move, my heart still racing in my chest. When the police arrived, about an hour later, I could barely speak. I told them everything, but my words were jumbled, my thoughts scattered. They searched the alley where it happened, but found nothing. No trace of him, just the brown, sticky banana peel lying in the damp mist. A reminder of what had almost been. The next few days felt surreal. I replayed the encounter over and over, but it didn't really sink in. What if I'd gone down that alley? What if I hadn't fought back? What if he hadn't made that mistake? I would be lying if I said the fear didn't linger. It haunted me, but I also knew I had survived. I had gotten away, and that, in itself, was the most important thing. I pulled into the gated community near Branson, Missouri, early one morning with a hot tub I was delivering. It was one of those fancy homes built on the side of the hill, each one bigger and more extravagant than the last. The driveway was steep, winding up toward the house, and as I parked, I could see the construction workers already hustling around. It was one of those homes still under construction, and a lot of things were being done at once. I was delivering a hot tub, a big one, about 900 pounds, and it was meant to go onto the fourth floor balcony. But this was one of those houses where the ground floor was technically the fourth, and the other 3 floors were built into the hillside, so the house kind of hung over the edge. When I pulled up, the first thing I noticed was the steep drop on the backside of the house. If I wasn't careful, I'd be in a world of trouble, but the guys on the job assured me it would be no big deal. The construction workers directed me to where the hot tub was supposed to go, and I began unloading the tub. I could tell right away that getting it onto the balcony wasn't going to be as easy as just rolling it up to the front door. The guys pointed me toward the side yard, where we could make a ramp and get it up to the porch, then through the living room and out onto the deck. I sighed, but didn't complain. This was my job, and I'd done deliveries like this before. I set to work, building a ramp from the driveway down into the yard, up to the porch, through the living room, and out onto the deck. It didn't take me long, but it wasn't a straight shot. The deck, of course, wasn't finished. A large portion of the deck was missing, and they only had enough boards down to allow me to get from the patio doors to the far corner where the tub was supposed to sit. There were no guardrails or anything else to keep us from falling, and the drop was easily 4 stories. The tub sat there on its dolly, heavy and awkward but manageable. I've been in the delivery business long enough to know how to move a hot tub. You roll them on their edge, tilt them, and drop them down, slowly but steadily, onto whatever surface you want. The trick is making sure you have the right amount of help and a clear, steady path. The guys helping me were all construction workers, but not the sharpest tools in the shed. They were trying to help, but they kept getting in the way. I could tell they didn't fully understand the logistics of what I was doing. I had to explain over and over again that we needed to put blocks under one side of the dolly so we could tilt the tub, pop the strap, and then remove the dolly. Simple enough. But there was one problem. The deck wasn't wide enough to do this safely. I got the tub onto the deck with the help of the guys holding the tub on either side. I was starting to feel a bit tense, knowing the narrowness of the space and the fact that there was nothing but air beneath us. But we were almost there. I could see the spot where it was going to sit. I told the guys to freeze as I carefully tilted the tub onto its edge. The weight of it was bearing down on the dolly, and my feet were nearly flush with the edge of the deck. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I carefully shifted my feet back, inch by inch. The tub was heavy, and I had to get the dolly free. One of the guys was trying to help by removing the dolly from the bottom, but his impatience was starting to show. Instead of working slowly and carefully, he kicked the corner of the tub in frustration, hoping it would pop loose. That was the moment everything went wrong. I wasn't prepared for the shift in weight. One moment, I was steady, and the next, I felt the deck beneath me tilt slightly. I felt my heels start to slide, and before I knew it, I was falling. My feet had no grip, and there was nothing to stop me from going over. I shouted, "I'm falling," but it was too late. I could feel myself tipping backward, and everything slowed down for a moment. My arms windmilled as I struggled to catch something, anything, to keep myself from plummeting. I could see the ground far below, the jagged boulders, the distant trees. For stories down, the only thing waiting for me was the unforgiving earth. I reached out, but there was nothing. The deck was too narrow for me to grab onto anything. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach as my body slipped further toward the edge. I was falling, and there was nothing I could do about it. And then, something unexpected happened. There was a sudden, sharp tug at my back, yanking me forward. I slammed into the bottom of the hot tub with all my weight, the impact knocking the wind out of me. But it wasn't the tub that saved me. It was the strap that had been loosely hanging off the deck. I hadn't even realized it, but the useless guy, the one who had been fiddling with the strap the entire time, had already secured one end of it to the house. When I fell, the strap caught me, pulling tight like a lifeline, jerking me forward before I could fall any further. I don't know how it happened, but I know that without that strap, I would have been dead. The guy who had secured the strap yanked on it with all his strength, pulling me back towards the deck. It wasn't meant to catch me, but it did. The other guys rushed to help, grabbing the hot tub and stabilizing it, while the guy who saved me, who up until that point I had thought was completely useless, was the one who made sure I didn't die that day. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I was shaken, absolutely terrified, and my heart was still racing, but somehow I managed to get myself back onto the deck. The guys set the tub down, and I took a minute to gather myself. I thanked them, but more than anything, I thanked the guy who had saved me. Without him, I wouldn't have made it. The next day, I couldn't get the incident out of my head. I kept replaying it in my mind, imagining what might have happened if I hadn't been caught. But then I thought about the guy who had saved me, the one who had barely seemed like he knew what he was doing. And it struck me that I owed him something. He didn't know it, but he had just given me my life. I'd been saving for a vacation, planning to surprise my wife and daughter with a trip to Breckenridge, Colorado for Christmas. Wasn't much, but it was something special I had planned for them. But when I thought about the guy, I knew I had to do something for him. So I called him up and told him I was sending him and his family to Breckenridge for Christmas. I didn't care if my wife and daughter didn't know about it. I didn't care if I had to delay our vacation. That guy deserved it. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about himself. He just acted when it mattered. And that's something you don't forget. That moment was one of the scariest things I've ever gone through. But in the end, it taught me something I'll never forget. Sometimes, the people you least expect to be heroes are the ones who save your life. And sometimes, the most terrifying moments are the ones that bring the most clarity. It was around 3 a.m. last summer when I found myself back at my parents' house for the holidays. I had just finished a long day of catching up with old friends and running errands. The house was quiet, still, and dark, like it always is late at night when everyone else is asleep. I had spent most of the evening in my room on my computer, browsing through old memories, looking at pictures, and mindlessly scrolling through social media. The house felt like it was holding its breath, each creak and shift in the wood of the old floorboards beneath me sending a shiver down my spine. I was just starting to feel that heavy pull of sleep coming over me when my phone suddenly lit up. It was a call from my sister. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, sure, it was late, but I figured she just wanted to chat or needed something. But then I realized something odd. Her room was just down the hallway, a few doors down from mine. If she wanted to talk, she could have just come in like she always does. It was strange that she was calling me, especially at this hour. I swiped to answer, but the moment I reached the phone, the call ended. I stared at the screen, confused. I held the phone up to my ear as if she might call back, but nothing happened. It was silent, too quiet. After a few seconds of nothing, I just shrugged it off. Maybe she had just accidentally called me, or maybe it was some weird glitch. But then, an overwhelming urge to check on her kicked in. I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to see her to make sure everything was okay. So, I put the phone down and stood up from my desk. The old wooden floor creaked beneath my feet as I crossed the room, and I pulled open my bedroom door. The hallway was dark, only the faintest sliver of light leaking through the crack under the bathroom door. I stood there for a moment, listening. Everything was eerily still. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the kind of sound you don't notice until everything else around you is quiet. I took a step forward, then another, moving down the hallway toward her room. The floorboards creaked again under my weight, and my footsteps echoed in the silence. I wasn't sure why I was nervous, but I could feel my pulse picking up, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. When I reached her door, I stopped. I could hear her voice, muffled but panicked, coming through the thin door. She was screaming. I had no idea what was happening, but my heart raced in an instant. My sister rarely ever screamed like that. There was something in her voice that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't waste a second. I swung the door open with a force that startled me. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at me, her face pale, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. The room was empty. No one else was there, but she was trembling, her hands clutching the edge of the bed for dear life. "Someone's in here," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper through her sobs. I froze. My mind raced, trying to process what was going on. I had just walked in, and there was no sign of anyone. No strange shadows, no movement, nothing. I stepped inside, scanning the room quickly. The small lamp on her nightstand cast a soft glow across the space, illuminating the familiar clutter of books, clothes, and random objects scattered around. Her window was closed, and the curtains hung still, not a hint of movement in the air. The door to the hallway was wide open, so if someone had been in here, they would have had plenty of time to slip away. I turned back to her, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no one here, sis. Are you sure?" She shook her head violently. I swear, I woke up and there was a shadow right next to me. It was so close. It was like it was right in my face. I looked at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. She seemed like she was on the verge of a breakdown, and I couldn't blame her. I would have been scared too if I had woken up to something like that. Was it a dream? I asked cautiously, knowing that could have been a possibility, but she shook her head again, this time more urgently. "No, it wasn't a dream. It was real. I was awake. It was like a person, but it wasn't. It was just this dark, this shadow, and it was so close to me. It felt like it was breathing on me, like it was right there." She wiped at her eyes, trying to calm herself, but her hand was shaking so badly that she couldn't seem to stop them. I didn't know what to say to that. The whole thing sounded surreal, like something out of a movie, but here I was, standing in her room, watching her freak out like this, and I couldn't explain it. I didn't know how to reassure her when everything about it felt off. Then a thought occurred to me, something that only added to the growing sense of dread I had started to feel. "You called me," I said, watching her carefully. Her eyes widened, and she quickly shook her head. "No, I didn't. But I have a missed call from you," I told her. "I just picked up the phone when it rang, and it was from you. I thought you wanted to talk or something." She blinked, clearly confused. "I didn't call you. My phone's downstairs in my purse. I've been in bed the whole time." I looked at her, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. That didn't make sense. How could she have called me if her phone wasn't even in the room? I glanced at the phone in my hand again, staring at the log. Sure enough, there it was, her name, the time of the call. But she had no record of it on her phone. I checked hers again just to be sure, but there was no missed call, no recent activity, nothing. This was getting weirder by the second. "Your phone's downstairs?" I asked, trying to process it. She nodded, still looking utterly lost. I didn't know what to make of it. I stood there, holding my phone in one hand, my sister's terrified face in the other. It felt like the world had just tilted a little bit, like something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "I don't know what's going on," she whispered. "I don't know why I woke up like that, or why you got that call, or why the shadow was so real. I just feel like something isn't right." I wanted to comfort her, to say something that would make this all go away, but I couldn't. I was just as confused and freaked out as she was. Eventually, I led her out of her room and back into the hallway, trying to get us both to calm down. We sat together in the living room for a while, neither of us really speaking. The quiet of the house felt suffocating, each passing minute making it harder to shake the sense of unease that had settled over me. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting another strange call or some other bizarre occurrence to happen. But nothing did. The rest of the night passed without incident, and we eventually went back to our rooms. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the call, about the shadow, about everything that didn't make sense. The next day, we checked around the house. We looked in every room, checked all the windows, the locks, the doors. We couldn't find anything out of place. Everything seemed normal, too normal. But that nagging feeling never went away. The call, the shadow, the confusion, it all felt like something bigger, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe there was a logical explanation hiding in all of this, some simple explanation that would make it all make sense. But I haven't found it. We never figured it out. And to this day, I still don't know what really happened that night, what made my sister see what she did, or why I got that call. All I know is that some things in life don't have answers, and sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't make sense of it all. When I was about 10, it was one of those rare evenings when all of my cousins and siblings were gathered at my grandparents' house. There were about 10 of us, all packed into the living room, just hanging out. The parents had gone out for an adult dinner, so it was just the kids, enjoying a quiet night of movies and snacks. We were spread out on the floor, some of us lounging on the couch, others sitting cross-legged just talking and laughing. The house was old, the kind with creaky floors and narrow hallways. The living room had an old brick fireplace that was never used anymore. The walls were covered with pictures of family members and old memories, and the worn-out carpet smelled faintly of dust and the occasional cedar wood from the little cabinet my grandparents kept all their old photos in. It was the kind of house where everything felt comfortable and familiar, like nothing bad could ever happen there. But that night, everything changed. We had just started watching another movie when, without warning, the house shook. It was a violent tremor, one that made the old wood creak and groan like it was under immense pressure. My body jolted, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy falling somewhere in the house. It felt like a bomb had gone off, this intense, gut-shaking explosion that rattled the windows and sent a wave of panic through all of us. At the exact same time, there was a flash of light from the backyard, so bright it made everything else look dim by comparison. For a split second, the room was bathed in a pale, almost blinding glow, like the sun had risen inside the house. The light was so sharp and sudden, it made me squint. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared. The afterimage of it lingered in my vision, like I had stared at a bright light for too long. My heart raced in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't just the explosion, it was the sheer suddenness of it, the unknown. The sound, the shaking, and the light were all too much for us. Instinctively, we all rushed into the hallway. I don't even know how it happened so fast, but within seconds, we were all huddled together, pressed against the walls, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was a lot of chaos in the hallway, kids stumbling over each other, asking questions, looking around as if the answer to the explosion might appear out of thin air. But there were no answers, just confusion, fear, and a feeling of something terrible about to happen. The oldest cousin, Michael, was the first to speak up. He was 16 at the time, and the only one of us who seemed to have his head on straight. He said, "We need to call the police." The others nodded, but no one moved. It was like we were all frozen in place, unsure what to do next. Michael hesitated, glancing back down the hall toward the living room, as if expecting something or someone to show up any second. But then, just as quickly as the panic had started, it began to fade. The house remained still. There were no more shakes, no more flashes. It was almost like it never happened. The only sound in the hallway was the soft rustling of clothes as we all stood there, trying to process what had just occurred. A few minutes passed, and Michael, still calm, pulled out his phone. "We should call the parents," he suggested. And after a brief discussion, that's exactly what we did. There was no way we could call the police. They'd probably think we were overreacting, especially considering how quiet everything had gotten. So we called our parents instead. As each of us took turns explaining what had happened, I couldn't help but notice how shaky everyone's voice was, including mine. "I don't know, it just shook," I said. There was a huge flash in the house. It felt like it was going to collapse. I could hear my mom on the other end, trying to stay calm, but even she sounded a bit confused. She told us to stay where we were, that they'd be home soon. When the call ended, we all just stood there for a while, listening to the quiet. It felt too peaceful, like the calm before a storm. But nothing came. The seconds dragged into minutes, then half an hour, and still nothing. No more shaking, no more flashing lights. It was like it had never happened. Maybe we had all just imagined it, but I knew we hadn't. The fear in my chest wouldn't let me believe that. It felt too real, too intense to just dismiss. We finally gathered up enough courage to head back to the living room, but none of us went alone. We moved like a pack, stepping cautiously into the room, our eyes darting toward the window, expecting something out of place. But there was nothing. The backyard was dark, as it should have been, and the world outside seemed perfectly still. We stood there for a while. None of us wanted to be the first to speak. The TV was still on, but no one was paying attention to it anymore. We were all too preoccupied with what had just happened and trying to make sense of it. About 10 minutes after we had returned to the living room, we heard the sound of tires crunching against gravel. Our parents were back. The sense of dread didn't lift when they walked in. I could see it in their faces. They thought we were being dramatic, overreacting. We must have imagined it, they said. Nothing had happened, they insisted. The backyard looked fine when they checked it. No neighbors had reported any disturbances. But it happened. We all protested. It was real. The explosion, the light, it was so loud. We all felt it, but they didn't understand. To them, we were just kids, freaking out over something that didn't make sense. They chalked it up to us being scared of a loud noise. Maybe a car backfiring or fireworks from somewhere far away. But that didn't explain the flash, the shaking of the house. That didn't explain how everything had gone from calm to chaos in the blink of an eye. We never really got an explanation for what happened that night. And as the years passed, the memory of it didn't fade. It haunted us. Whenever we got together as a family, especially when all the cousins were around, we would talk about it. Sometimes it was a light-hearted discussion, with everyone trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a transformer blowing somewhere. Maybe it was some sort of electrical malfunction. Some of the older cousins would say it was just an earthquake, even though no one else had felt it. But no one had an answer that made sense. And even after all these years, that night still lingers in my mind. I remember the way the light flashed, too bright, too sudden. The rumble that shook the entire house, making the floor beneath my feet feel like it was going to give way. The fear that ran through all of us as we ran for safety, unsure of what we were running from. It was a fear I've never quite been able to shake off. I don't know what happened that night. To this day, I can't figure it out. Was it something we all just imagined? A weird coincidence? Or is it something more? All I know is that for a brief moment, something happened that shouldn't have, something that couldn't be explained. And in the years that followed, that lingering uncertainty made me question everything. The world around me, the things I thought I knew. How could something like that happen, and yet there be no trace of it? That's what keeps me awake at night sometimes, long after everyone else has fallen asleep. Not knowing what it was, why it happened, or if it's ever going to happen again. And every time I look out into the backyard, even in the brightest light of day, part of me still expects to see that flash, that unsettling light, and to feel the house shake once more. It was the scariest thing to ever happen to me, and I still don't know what to make of it. But I'll never forget the fear I felt in those moments. The fear of something unseen, something beyond understanding, something that felt like it came out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. I was 17 when I first got my driver's license. I still remember the feeling of freedom, the weight of the keys in my pocket, the anticipation of being able to go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted. That summer, my friends and I had this little tradition, finding abandoned houses and throwing parties in them. It wasn't anything special, just a group of dumb teenagers trying to have fun, acting like we were tougher than we were. We thought we were untouchable, like we could get away with anything. But there's something about being young and invincible that makes you do stupid things. There were a few decent candidates for these parties around town. Old, neglected houses hidden away on back roads or behind overgrown trees. Places nobody seemed to care about anymore. But there was one house that stood out above the rest. It was this huge, unfinished mansion on the outskirts of town, sitting on a piece of property so big you could get lost just walking around it. I drive past it on my way home from work all the time, and every time I saw it, I couldn't help but feel a little drawn to it. It was strange. Part of me knew something was off about it, but another part of me was just fascinated by it. The place had been under construction for years, but it looked abandoned. No lights, no signs of life, just this giant shell of a house, like someone had started building it and then just gave up. One afternoon, I mentioned it to one of my friends, Tom. He was always up for whatever. So when I told him about the house, he immediately wanted to check it out. That day, we planned on going to see a movie later, so I suggested we stop by the house first, just to see what it was like. It was summer, and it was just starting to get dark by the time we drove out there. I had my headlights on, but the place still looked eerie in the fading light. We pulled up in front of the house, and for a second, everything was silent. The kind of silence that felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. I didn't say anything, but I could tell Tom felt it too. We stayed there for maybe 10 seconds before I decided to turn around and head back. It didn't feel right being there, but I wasn't sure why. The house was intimidating, sure, but there was something else, something more unsettling. I couldn't put my finger on it. I pulled back onto the main road, planning on just getting out of there. We were barely a minute down the road when I noticed the headlights of a big truck in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was late, and there were always other people on the road, but then the truck got closer, a little too close. The bright beams of its headlights started to feel like they were right on top of us, and the truck started riding our tail like it was in a hurry. I glanced over at Tom, and I could tell he noticed it too. I kept driving, not wanting to overthink it, but the truck wouldn't back off. The road curved around a little, and I turned right at the light. Just as I did, the truck followed, cutting through the parking lot of a gas station at the corner to block us off. The truck came to a stop in front of us, its massive grille looming in the dark. Great, I muttered under my breath. Tom's face was pale, and I could see his hand gripping the armrest like he was preparing for something to happen. I stopped, not sure what to do. The truck's engine rumbled, and the headlights cast long shadows on the pavement. Then, out of the truck came this huge man. I mean, he was massive. Broad shoulders, a thick neck, and arms like tree trunks. He was wearing a flannel shirt, the kind that looked like it was a size too small for him. His boots thudded on the asphalt as he walked toward us. I couldn't help but feel a knot twist in my stomach. It didn't make sense. This was a busy road, and yet there wasn't a single other car in sight. Just the two of us sitting there, with this guy slowly walking up to our window. Tom and I froze, staring at each other for a second. There was no way out. The man approached the car slowly, methodically, his eyes focused on us the whole time. When he reached the window, I could smell the faint scent of cigarette smoke on him. I rolled the window down, and he knocked on the glass with a heavy fist, making a sound that almost made my heart stop. "What were you doing at that house?" he asked, his voice gruff and low. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. My mouth went dry, and all I could think was that I needed to get out of there. I needed to lie. I quickly came up with the most basic excuse I could think of. "We were just making a U-turn," I said, trying to sound casual. He stared at me for a long moment, like he was sizing me up. Then he smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that stretched across his face, showing too many teeth. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made you feel like you were prey, like you were being sized up for something. It made my skin crawl. After what felt like forever, he took a step back and nodded toward the road. "All right," he said simply, and then he turned and walked back to his truck without another word. I didn't wait around to see what else he had in mind. I slammed the car into drive and sped off, not looking back. I didn't say anything to Tom, but I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. That had been way too close. The whole thing didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't sure why. We went to the movie, but neither of us really enjoyed it. We kept talking about what had just happened, trying to make sense of it. We both agreed that it had been strange, but there was something more about it, something that didn't add up. The way he just appeared out of nowhere. The way the road had gone from busy to completely empty in a matter of seconds. The way he smiled at us, like he knew something we didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just run into something dangerous. The next day, I went back past the house. It was still the same, a half-finished, abandoned mess. But now, every time I passed it, I felt a twinge of anxiety in my chest. Something about that place didn't feel right, like there was more to it than just an abandoned house. It stayed unfinished for years, and to this day, it still sits there, a skeleton of a building with no life in it. I've heard rumors over the years, whispers about it being a front for something darker, something illegal, but I never stuck around to find out. Looking back, I realized we were lucky that night. That man could have done anything. He could have pulled us out of the car, made us wish we had never set foot near that place. He could have dragged us into whatever it was that was happening there. But instead, he just smiled and let us go. It didn't make sense, and that's what still bothers me the most. It wasn't about us, not really. It was about the house and whatever it was hiding. To this day, I won't go near that house. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't just an abandoned building. Something dark was going on there, and I think we came way too close to finding out what it was. That's why I say, don't go into abandoned houses. There's always more to the story than you think, and sometimes it's better not to know. The house sits far back from the street, a bit isolated from the other homes around it. I never minded that much. It had a certain charm. The layout was strange though. The sidewalk ran along the length of the living room and stopped at the porch, which led directly into the living room. The windows were huge, so large that they stretched almost from floor to ceiling, but they didn't open. A little odd, right? They let in an incredible amount of light, which is great during the day, but they offered zero privacy. Anyone walking by could see right in, and sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a neighbor's curious stare. The kind that makes you wonder how many people actually keep an eye on you when you're not looking. But whatever, it wasn't a big deal. It was a late summer evening when I finally got the house all to myself. My family was away on vacation, and I figured I'd take full advantage of the solitude. They'd be gone for a week, and I had the place all to myself. I wasn't much of a party person, but I liked to drink every now and then. So I grabbed a bottle of whiskey and cracked it open while I threw on some music. After a couple of hours, I had done what I usually do when I'm alone, get a little too drunk, lie on the couch, and pass out. That's exactly what happened. I fell asleep in the living room, my head resting on the arm of the couch, and the sound of my music still faintly playing in the background. I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. Just this sense of panic, this sudden feeling like I wasn't alone. I blinked my eyes open and looked around, confused. The living room was dark now. The music had stopped playing, and there was an unsettling chill in the air. I couldn't place it, but something wasn't right. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't figure out why. I tried to sit up, but the coldness I felt seemed to seep into my bones, and I just stayed there, frozen for a moment. That's when I heard it, a loud thumping sound coming from above me. It echoed through the quiet house, deep and rhythmic. My eyes darted up toward the window. Someone was there. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a shadow against the faint light coming from outside. They were pounding on the glass, their fists hitting the window with force. I didn't move. I couldn't. The sound seemed to vibrate through my chest, and I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was someone standing there? Who was it? There was no reason for anyone to be at my house, especially not this late at night. I slowly shifted my gaze toward the cable box on the coffee table. The clock on it read 3 a.m. I felt a rush of cold sweat trickle down my spine. The thumping continued, relentless, as if whoever was out there was determined to get my attention. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body felt like stone, my heart hammering in my chest. The only thing I could do was listen to the sound, every beat of it growing louder and more frantic. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away, that it was just some prank or something that would end with them walking off. But it didn't stop. It just kept going. I felt trapped, unable to move, unable to think straight. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the thumping stopped. There was a brief moment of silence, so still that I thought maybe it had all been a dream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The quiet hung in the air, suffocating. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all. But then it started again. But this time, it wasn't just from the window. There was a new sound coming from the front door. A loud banging, sharp and loud, just like the thumping on the window. Someone was pounding on the door now, as if they were trying to break it down. The two sounds, banging from the window and from the door, together filled the space with an intensity that made it feel like my whole body was vibrating. Whoever was outside was determined to make their presence known. But why? What did they want? What was going on? I stayed absolutely still, my eyes fixed on the window, hoping that whoever was out there would just leave. But they didn't. The banging from both directions continued, each strike seeming to get louder and faster. I could hear their fists pounding, the sound reverberating through the walls, making my head spin. It felt like hours, even though I knew it was only minutes. My mind was racing with panic and confusion. I wanted to call someone, to scream, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped again. The silence was deafening. I sat there, not sure what to do. My legs felt like lead, and the chill that had overtaken me had only gotten worse. I couldn't decide if I should get up, if I should call the police, or if I should just stay hidden and wait. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. And then it happened again. The pounding returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't just coming from the front door or the window. Now, the sound was coming from both places, and this is what really did it. There was someone moving around the house, their footsteps heavy against the porch. It was like they were trying to get in from every direction. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and a sense of dread flooded over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was completely paralyzed, my mind racing with thoughts of what was happening. Who were these people? What do they want? Why were they doing this? I heard the door handle jiggle, as if someone was trying to get inside. My breath hitched in my throat, and my eyes were wide with fear. I wanted to bolt, to run out the back door and just disappear into the night, but I couldn't. The fear was too much. I couldn't move. It felt like the whole house was closing in on me. The banging didn't stop. It went on for what felt like an eternity, but eventually it did stop again. The stillness that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like something was waiting just beyond your sight, just beyond your reach. I sat there, staring at the window, not daring to move, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. And then, nothing. The house was quiet again. I didn't know how long I stayed there, sitting on that couch, not moving a muscle. I didn't want to move. I was terrified to even breathe. I don't remember when I finally fell asleep. I don't know if I passed out from sheer exhaustion or if I just gave in to the fear and drifted off. All I know is that when I woke up again, the morning light was filtering in through the big windows, and everything felt normal. Too normal. There were no signs of anyone outside. No traces of the pounding or footsteps I had heard the night before. It was as if it had all been a bad dream. But I knew it wasn't. The fear still lingered in my chest, gnawing at me. I wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I called a friend to come over. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I needed someone to be there with me, someone who could help me make sense of what had happened. When I explained what had occurred, I expected him to be just as freaked out as I was, maybe even more so. But instead, he just laughed. "What the fuck for?" he said. "So that we can both be murdered in our sleep?" His words stung, but it was the truth. I knew it then. Whoever had been outside my house the night before, whoever had been banging on my windows and my door, hadn't been just some pranksters or random thieves. They'd had a purpose, and that purpose wasn't to scare me. They were testing me, pushing me to see if I would react, to see if I would panic. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't safe there anymore. The house that once felt like home, the place where I'd felt comfortable and secure, had turned into a cage. A place where someone was watching me. And I wasn't sure if they were still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. The fear that had gripped me that night never fully went away. It became a part of me, always lingering at the edge of my mind. I left that house soon after, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there, just beyond my reach. I had awesome parents. I mean, they were the kind of parents who didn't mind letting me sleep in the living room on weekends. My sister, who was a light sleeper, would always be in the other room, so I'd get the whole couch to myself. It was one of those things I always looked forward to. I could stay up as late as I wanted, watching Nick at Night reruns, or whatever caught my eye. But of course, I'd always end up falling asleep on the couch in the middle of whatever show was on. It didn't matter much. I was just happy to have that space and freedom, especially on weekends. One night, it felt different though. It felt like something was off. I don't know how to explain it. You know that feeling you get sometimes, like when someone's watching you, even though you can't see them? It was like that, but stronger, like something deep inside me just clicked. I bolted up on the couch, my heart racing, and my eyes shot straight toward the front window. We lived in rural Georgia, where the trees felt like they stretched for miles in every direction, thick and dense. The kind of trees that could easily hide something in their shadows, something that could stay out of sight for a long time. I tried to shake off the feeling, but then I saw it. A silhouette. In the moonlight, it was unmistakable. There was someone in the tree. I could make out the shape of a person, crouched low, just perched there, watching the house. At first, my mind couldn't even process what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? No, it was too real, too clear. The figure didn't move. It was just there, as still as a rock. I felt the fur on the back of my neck stand up. Then, out of nowhere, the family dog, Max, darted to the window. He started growling and snarling into the glass, his teeth bared like he could smell something I couldn't. His barking grew louder, more frantic. It was almost like he knew whatever was outside wasn't something friendly. I froze. My heart was in my throat. Everything inside me screamed to run to my parents, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I wanted to shout for help, but my throat tightened and no sound came out. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that I was just imagining things, but I knew deep down that wasn't the case. There was something out there. I couldn't stay on the couch any longer. I shot up, my feet barely touching the floor as I bolted from my parents' room. I banged on the door, nearly tripping over my own feet. "Mom, Dad, there's someone outside," I said, my voice shaky, barely a whisper. My dad was up and moving instantly. He didn't waste any time. He grabbed something defensive from the drawer, something I didn't recognize at the time, but always assumed was for emergencies, and headed toward the door. The dog was already charging outside, barking as if he had no fear of whatever was out there. I wanted to follow, to make sure everything was okay, but I stayed behind, trembling in my mother's arms. She tried to comfort me, but the fear that had gripped me didn't let go. We could hear the dogs barking loudly in the distance, moving around the yard, and then silence. I don't know how long we waited, but it felt like forever. The air in the room was thick with unease. My mom was whispering to me, trying to calm me down, but I couldn't stop shaking. Every noise, every creak of the house made my heart skip a beat. My mind raced. What was happening? Who was out there? Why hadn't my dad come back yet? Eventually, the door opened and my dad stepped in, looking calm but tired. His eyes were scanning the room, checking on me, and then he sighed. "I didn't see anyone," he said, his voice soft but firm. "There's nothing out there. It was probably just a raccoon or something. You're okay. Go to bed now." I didn't believe him. I couldn't, but I was too exhausted, too terrified to argue. I wanted to feel safe again. I wanted to believe him, but every part of me was still alert, still aware of that strange presence I'd felt earlier. That feeling didn't go away. I reluctantly went back to my room, pulling the covers tightly around me. My sister, who had woken up when we made all that noise, sat up and asked me what had happened. I told her about the man in the tree, about Max going crazy, about Dad going outside. I couldn't stop talking about it. I needed someone to understand. My sister didn't say much, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Dad was making his rounds, checking the windows, sipping from his coffee cup. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath, like we were all waiting for something, but we didn't know what. It was quiet again, too quiet. I finally thought, okay, it's time. I can sleep now. I tried to settle back into my bed, my eyes slowly closing, the darkness in the room creeping in, mixing with the dim light from the hallway. But then I noticed something. Movement. Something was outside my window. I froze. There, just barely visible in the light from the moon, was the figure again. The same man, standing at the edge of my window, just a few feet away. He was looking right at me, his face hidden in shadow, but his body was unmistakable. I couldn't see his features, but I knew he was there, watching. Then, with a chilling, deliberate slowness, he put his finger to his lips, signaling for me to be quiet. I felt my heart drop to my stomach. He wasn't just standing there anymore. He wasn't just watching. He was acknowledging me. He knew I was there. I wanted to scream, to shout for my dad, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body. All I could do was watch as he turned away from the window and, with unnatural speed, darted off into the darkness, running straight into the woods behind the house. I don't know how long I lay there after that. My mind was racing, my body frozen in place. I couldn't even cry. It felt like my whole body was in shock. I thought about running to my parents again, but I knew I'd never make it. I was too scared to move. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. I couldn't tell. The night dragged on like it would never end. Finally, I heard my dad's voice outside my room, low and steady, like he was trying to reassure himself more than anyone else. He checked on me again, asking if I was okay, but I didn't know how to respond. I was still too terrified to speak. The next morning, everything felt wrong. The day was bright and sunny, but the house seemed too quiet. My dad went outside again, this time checking the yard thoroughly, looking for any sign of someone being there. There was nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. Just a normal rural mess of a yard. It was as if the man had never been there at all. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us, someone who shouldn't have been there. I never told my dad about the shush signal. Part of me was afraid that it would sound crazy, like I was just making it up. We never found out who it was or why they were there. That night, that feeling, it stayed with me for a long time. And to this day, I can still remember the way the figure stood in that tree, just waiting for something. I never slept as soundly again, not in that house, not in that room. The fear had woven itself into the very fabric of my being, and no matter how much I wanted to forget, every creak in the night, every rustle in the trees made me remember. Sometimes I still wonder if someone was really out there, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I think about that man's face hidden in shadow and the way he knew exactly when I was looking. That's when I'm sure it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever it was real. A few summers ago, I decided to go for a late-night bike ride with a friend. It was one of those warm, quiet nights where the air is thick with the scent of grass and asphalt, and everything around you seems to hum with a sort of peaceful calm. We were both looking for a break from the usual, just a casual ride to stretch our legs and get out of the house. It wasn't anything too unusual. We'd been riding for a couple of hours, chatting, laughing, enjoying the night. Eventually, though, the night started to wear on, and we realized it was well past midnight. My friend had to head home, and we said our goodbyes near a street corner, each of us heading off in opposite directions. I had about 2 blocks to ride before reaching my own place. The streets were completely dead, no cars in sight, no people, just the faint hum of city lights reflecting off the pavement. There was some construction going on down the road, so I was forced to ride on the sidewalk for a little bit. The sidewalk wasn't wide by any means, but it was manageable, and I didn't mind. The road was mostly empty anyway, so the space didn't feel crowded. I didn't really think much about it as I rode, letting the cool air hit my face and the soft squeak of my bike's wheels becoming the only sound in the night. It felt good, peaceful even. I wasn't in a rush. I had no reason to be. I had just finished hanging out with a friend, and the night felt like it was just beginning. That's when I saw him. Right at the point where I was about to turn left onto my street, I noticed a man walking in front of me. He was in his 40s, maybe a bit older, with a scruffy beard, slightly unkempt hair, and a worn-out jacket that didn't scream homeless but certainly had seen better days. He didn't seem threatening at first glance. He looked like just another person out late, maybe coming from a bar or just walking off a rough day. His pace was steady, and he didn't look at me as I got closer. The sidewalk was narrow, though, and I knew I had to pass him. I had about 6 feet of space between us, and the last thing I wanted was to surprise him or make him feel uncomfortable. I didn't know why, but for some reason, something about the situation didn't feel entirely right. Maybe it was the way he was walking, or the fact that he was by himself at this hour when most people were either home or at least in groups. I wasn't sure, but I decided to say something. So I called out, "Hey, behind you." It was just a casual heads up, nothing more. The second I spoke, he whipped around, his eyes locking onto mine with a look of pure, unfiltered rage. His face twisted into an expression of anger, his eyes bulging with a sudden shift from calm to something much darker. I felt a chill run through me as he glared at me like I had done something terribly wrong, something unforgivable. I didn't say anything else. I wasn't sure what to do at that moment. He didn't say anything either, but his gaze was so intense that it felt like he was trying to pierce right through me. For a moment, I thought about stopping and maybe apologizing, but there was this instinct, this gut feeling that told me to just keep going. So I did. I turned down my street, hoping that was the end of it. I didn't want to think about it too much, just wanted to get home and put the whole thing behind me. But as I pedaled down my street, I could hear footsteps behind me. They were slow at first, but as the minutes went by, they grew louder. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but there was something unsettling about how the footsteps matched my pace. Then he started shouting. His voice was ragged and full of venom. "You fucking cunt," he screamed. "I'm going to kill you, you fucking bitch." It didn't make any sense. What had I done to provoke him? I hadn't even done anything to make him angry. I was just trying to get home. But now, it felt like he was following me, his words laced with threats and curses. My heart started pounding faster, and a knot formed in my stomach. I looked ahead, knowing my house was just up the street. I didn't want him to know where I lived. I didn't want him to follow me home. So, I made a quick decision. I turned around and looped back around the block. It wasn't the safest choice, but it felt like my best option at that moment. I rode as fast as I could, hoping that by doubling back, I'd lose him. I looped around, taking the side streets, hoping that when I passed my house again, he wouldn't be paying attention. I didn't want him to know which house was mine. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands gripped tightly around the handlebars, my mind racing. I thought maybe I had shaken him off. Maybe he had given up and gone home. But as I rounded the corner back onto my street, I saw him. He was standing on my front stoop, staring out into the street like he had been waiting for me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. He wasn't doing anything, not saying anything, just standing there, staring. I swear to God, It was like he knew exactly where I lived. I froze for a moment, barely able to process what I was seeing. He saw me ride by again, but he didn't shout, didn't yell. He just stood there, staring, his expression unreadable. My whole body went cold, and I could feel my breath catch in my chest. I wasn't sure what to do. My first thought was to keep riding and not stop. But my legs were already exhausted, and the thought of going anywhere near him again made my stomach turn. So, I decided to go back to my friend's place. It wasn't the best decision, but it was the only one I could make. I needed to be somewhere with people, somewhere I felt safe. I rode back to my friend's house, trying not to look behind me. I didn't want to know if he was still following me, didn't want to acknowledge that he might still be out there. All I wanted was to get to safety. I stayed there for a while, trying to shake the feeling of that man's presence from my mind. But even though I was safe, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. 2 days later, my bike was stolen. It happened in the alleyway by my house. I had parked it there, thinking nothing of it, just a usual place to leave it. But when I went to grab it later, it was gone. I felt a cold sense of dread wash over me. I knew something was off. I didn't need to be told. The guy, the one I had seen standing on my stoop, I was sure it was him. I couldn't prove it, but I didn't need proof. He knew where I lived. He had made sure of that. I told my mom about it, and we both agreed it was probably best to not get the police involved until something more serious happened. But I didn't feel safe anymore, not in my own neighborhood. Not with the knowledge that someone had been watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. That man, he wasn't homeless. I had made that assumption, but it wasn't true. He was just like anyone else in the city, blending in, looking normal enough. I've come to realize that it's the ones who look normal who could be the most unsettling. Because, in the end, you don't know what's really going on in someone's head. I never saw that man again. I don't know if he was still around or if he had moved on, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, didn't leave me for a long time. And to this day, when I'm out late, I always glance over my shoulder, just in case. The air felt thick as I pulled into the gravel driveway of the old farmhouse. The kind of house you only see in movies, the ones with peeling paint, cracked windows, and a front porch that creaks with every gust of wind. I hadn't expected the drive to be this long, but I decided to go off the main road and take a shortcut through some backcountry roads to get to my friend's cabin. I was already regretting it. The sky was turning dark, and the clouds were gathering like a bad omen. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It didn't seem like anyone was home. There was no light in the windows, no movement inside. My friend had warned me that the place was remote, but this felt different. The kind of quiet you can't ignore. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The wind was picking up and the trees were swaying, creaking like they were about to snap. I had always loved the outdoors, but something about this place made my skin crawl. I walked up to the front door, the steps sagging under my weight. There was a strange smell in the air, something like wet earth and old wood. The door was cracked open slightly, which was odd. My friend hadn't said anything about leaving the door open. I knocked on it, but there was no response. I knocked harder, but still nothing. The place was unnervingly quiet. Not a single bird, no rustling of leaves. Even the usual sounds of the countryside, the distant hum of traffic or the buzz of insects, were missing. The only sound was the wind, and even that felt wrong. I stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and I squinted into the darkness. The house was covered in dust. There were old pieces of furniture scattered around, covered with faded sheets. A fireplace sat against one wall, its hearth cold and empty. The smell of mildew was heavy in the air. I called out for my friend, but my voice didn't seem to carry. I looked around, searching for some sign of life. There was a staircase leading up to the second floor, and it looked like there was a light on upstairs. Maybe that's where my friend was. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to check upstairs. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed a faint sound, like a low thud. It was soft, barely noticeable, but it sent a chill down my spine. I stood still for a moment, listening, but the house was silent again. I climbed the stairs carefully, the wood groaning under my feet. At the top, I was met with a long hallway. The light I'd seen earlier was coming from a door at the far end, so I made my way toward it. As I got closer, I noticed that the door was ajar, and the room beyond it was dimly lit by a single lamp. I pushed the door open slowly, and the floor creaked in protest. The room was empty, except for an old armchair in the center. Something about the chair caught my attention. It was facing the corner of the room, the back of it toward the door. The room smelled stale, like something had been sitting there for years without being touched. I stepped further inside, my boots scraping against the worn wooden floor. I stopped dead in my tracks when I noticed something on the floor next to the chair. It was a small wooden box, but it was covered in a layer of dust, as if it hadn't been moved in ages. My curiosity got the better of me, and I bent down to pick it up. The box was heavier than I expected, and it made a faint clicking sound as I held it in my hands. I turned it over, expecting to see a lock or something that would keep it shut, but it was just a simple box. No locks, no hinges, just old wood and faded paint. I opened it slowly, half expecting something to jump out at me, but inside was only a single, yellowed piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. The writing was faded and hard to read, but I could make out a few words. "Don't go, he's coming." The rest of the words were too smudged to read. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What was this? A warning? I glanced around the room, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone. I quickly shoved the paper back in the box and set it down, my mind racing. I had to find my friend and get out of here. The silence of the house was deafening, and the unease I felt was growing by the second. I turned to leave the room, but as I did, I froze. There was a noise coming from the floor below, like someone had dropped something heavy. It was loud enough that I couldn't ignore it. My heart skipped a beat. I turned and hurried back down the stairs, my breath coming in short gasps. I reached the bottom and scanned the dark hallway. The air felt colder now, and I noticed a faint smell of something burning, like wood or something else. I glanced around, searching for any sign of my friend, but the house was still empty. The front door was still open, and I rushed toward it, hoping to make a quick escape. But as I stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The car was still parked in the driveway, but there was something wrong with it. The headlights were on, but the engine wasn't running. The door was open, and I could see the shadow of someone standing next to it, barely visible in the dim light. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I knew it wasn't my friend. Before I could react, the figure stepped forward. It was a man, tall and thin, with a face that was obscured by a shadow. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, and I could feel my legs lock up as I stood there frozen. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another step toward me. I could see his hands now, pale and trembling, but he wasn't holding anything, just standing there, watching me. My mind raced, but my body refused to move. I turned to look back at the house, but when I did, I saw something else. From the corner of the window, there was another figure, taller than the man outside, with long, dark hair that hung in front of its face. I felt my heart stop. The man was getting closer now, his movements slow and calculated. My body finally broke free of its paralysis, and I bolted toward the car, jumping inside and slamming the door behind me. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I slammed my foot on the gas, spinning the wheels on the gravel, and tore out of the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the house long behind me. I pulled over to the side of the road, hands still trembling, and took a few deep breaths to calm myself. I don't know who the man was or what he wanted, but I wasn't going back there. Ever. It wasn't until later, after I had calmed down enough to think, that I realized something. My friend had never told me about a house. He'd never mentioned any old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was as if he'd never even been there. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back. About 2 years ago, I was driving home from family reunion. It had been a long day, lots of food, too many stories, and the kind of small talk that drains you when you're trying to stay polite for hours. I remember checking the time as I walked out to my car. It was already past 10:30 p.m. The reunion had been held at my cousin's house, way out in the country, about 2 hours from my place. Everyone kept insisting I stay the night, even offer me the couch, but I had to work early the next morning. I figured, screw it, 2 hours isn't bad, and I just wanted to sleep in my own bed. The road back home wasn't anything special, just one of those narrow, winding highways you get out in the sticks. Trees lined both sides of the road, so close they almost touched the car if you drifted too far to the edge. The kind of roads that feel fine in the daytime, but at night they start looking like a scene from a horror film. Every few minutes a car would pass, going the other way, headlights cutting through the thick dark for a second before disappearing just as quick. No street lights, no houses for miles. Just black trees and the sound of tires on old pavement. About 45 minutes into the drive, it hit me. Not just a little sleepy. I'm talking that wave of tiredness that crashes down on you all at once, where your eyes feel like sandbags and your head keeps nodding before you jerk back up. I turned the radio up, rolled down the window, even slapped myself a few times to keep awake, but nothing worked. The road stretched on like it had no end, and I realized I couldn't keep going. I started looking for a gas station, a rest stop, even a well-lit shoulder would have worked. But there was nothing. Just woods and shadows, and that narrow strip of asphalt in front of me. I started getting desperate. I couldn't risk dozing off while driving. After another 10 minutes, I made a choice I now regret. I saw a spot where the bushes thinned out a little, and there was a patch of grass just wide enough to pull off the road without being seen easily. I turned off the headlights as I slowed down, rolled gently off the road, and stopped behind a wall of brush, hidden from any cars that might come by. It felt wrong, sure, but I told myself it was just for a few minutes, just long enough to close my eyes and recharge enough to keep going. I looked at the dash clock. 11:22 p.m. I leaned my seat back, locked the doors, and let myself drift off. I don't know how long I was out. It didn't feel like long, but I woke up to a sound that didn't fit. A soft scratching. At first, I thought it was just branches brushing the side of the car, maybe from the wind. But it was steady, deliberate. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. I sat up a little, squinting in the dark. The clock said 11:50 p.m. It was dead quiet, and the scratching had stopped. I sat there for another minute, listening. Nothing. I was still half asleep, my head foggy, my body heavy. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a raccoon. It didn't seem important enough to fully wake up for. So I let myself slide back into sleep. I wish I hadn't. When I woke again, something was different. My chest felt tight. The air in the car felt heavier. I checked the clock. 12:40 a.m. and the scratching was back. Louder this time. Same rhythm. Scratch, pause, scratch. But it didn't stop. It just kept going. My mouth felt dry, and my heart had already picked up speed before I even moved. Something about the sound. It didn't feel like claws. It didn't feel random. It felt curious, testing. I forced myself to move and sat up straight. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and I caught a glimpse of something. A shape. It was quick, there and gone, but it was enough. Something moved past the back of my car, just outside the red tint of the taillights. I leaned forward and squinted, trying to see more, but it was too dark. My brain jumped to old campfire stories. The hook man, the guy who stalks lovers parked on the side of the road. It's stupid, I know, but when you're alone in the woods with something scratching your car and you see something run off into the darkness, logic takes a back seat to fear. I turned the key, heart hammering, and the engine started up like a gunshot in the silence. I threw it into drive and peeled out onto the road without even checking for traffic. My hands were sweating, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running after me. I didn't see anything. Not yet. About 100 yards up, the road curved. As I came around the bend, my headlights lit up a car parked off to the side of the road, just sitting there with the driver's side door wide open. No hazard lights, no movement, just an open door swinging gently in the breeze. I slowed down, part of me curious, part of me stupid. I leaned a little to the side to try and see if anyone was inside. Could have been someone broken down, someone in trouble. But the driver's seat was empty. Something didn't feel right. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and I started to accelerate. That's when I glanced in the mirror again. I saw him. A man, at least I think it was a man, sprinted around the corner behind me, from the same direction I had just come. He was fast enough that he stayed in the headlights for only a second before vanishing into darkness again. He was yelling something, his arms pumping as he ran. I couldn't hear him through the glass and the engine, but I didn't need to. His body language said everything. He wasn't flagging me down for help. He wasn't asking for a ride. He was chasing me. I didn't stop to think. I didn't check my mirrors again. I just floored it. The car leapt forward, and I kept pushing it, even around the tight curves, tires whining on the turns. I didn't look back. Not once. I just kept driving, my mind running wild with every possibility. Who was he? Was he the one scratching my car? Was that his vehicle? What the hell was he doing out there in the middle of nowhere at nearly 1 a.m.? It wasn't just fear of him. It was fear of not knowing what he wanted. I didn't slow down until I saw lights in the distance. A gas station, still open, sitting like an oasis on the side of the highway. I pulled in fast and parked right under the brightest light I could find. There were a couple cars in the lot, a clerk visible through the windows. I sat there for a minute, engine running, watching the road behind me in case I'd been followed. Nothing came. Eventually I got out, went inside, bought a coffee I didn't drink, and used the bathroom. My hands were still shaking when I came out. I didn't feel safe, not really, but I felt like I had put enough distance between me and whatever that was. I stayed there for a while, probably 20 or 30 minutes, until I calmed down enough to keep driving. The rest of the way home was uneventful, just the empty road and my high beams cutting through the dark. When I got home, I checked the side of the car and the light of my driveway. There were faint marks on the back panel near the trunk. Not deep scratches, but enough that I knew it wasn't just the wind or a branch. Someone, or something, had been feeling around the back of my car. I told myself I'd call the cops the next day, just to report it. I never did. What was I going to say? Hey, someone scratched my car and chased me at midnight in the woods. They'd think I was drunk or imagining things. I still think about it sometimes. How close I was to getting out to check the sound the first time. How I almost stopped at that car with the open door. How close he was when he came around that corner. I don't know what would have happened if I'd hesitated even a second longer. I've never pulled over to sleep on the side of a road since. Doesn't matter how tired I am or how long the drive is. I'll take my chances with exhaustion or shell out for a crappy motel if I have to. I don't trust the dark anymore, not like I used to. There are people out there, real people, not ghosts or demons, just people who do things for reasons we'll never understand. People who wait in the places we think are empty. People who watch, who follow, who scratch. Next time you're tired on a long drive through nowhere, keep driving. Trust me. A few years back, I was out hiking alone in a forest I didn't know too well. It wasn't the first time I'd gone off trail. Actually, I prefer it that way. Something about getting off the path where most people walk makes the world feel bigger. You notice things you wouldn't notice otherwise. The trees look older, the air feels different, and the silence has weight to it. On that day, it was cloudy, late afternoon. The kind of day where everything feels still. Not quiet in a peaceful way. Quiet in that heavy way where it feels like even the birds are holding their breath. I'd followed a faint animal trail, something probably made by deer or raccoons. It twisted through thick undergrowth, around fallen trees, and under low-hanging branches. I kept pushing forward, not with any goal, just wanted to explore. After about 20 minutes of weaving deeper into the woods, I caught a smell. At first, I thought it was wildflowers or something rotting from a tree. Sweet, thick, and oddly sickening. It wasn't a natural sweet, more like syrup poured over something that's gone bad. It stopped me in my tracks. I stood still, breathing through my nose, tried to place it. The air was heavy with it. I knew that smell. It wasn't flowers or tree sap. I'd smelled something like it once when I found a dead raccoon in a ditch during a summer hike. Only this was stronger. Much stronger. Too strong to be an animal. Being curious, and I guess a little stupid, I moved toward it. I had to brush aside a curtain of thorny branches, which scratched at my arms. The ground felt softer there, spongy and damp under my boots. I pushed through and found myself in a small clearing, maybe 15 feet across. And that's where I saw him. A man laid out on his back, arms at his sides, one leg slightly bent like he'd collapsed their mid-step. He was wearing what looked like a blue flannel shirt and jeans, but they were soaked through with dark patches and clung to the shape of him like wet paper. His skin was swollen and greenish-black in places. Parts of it had split open, and dark fluids had leaked out into the dirt around him. There were flies everywhere. The worst thing, though, were the eyes, or rather, the sockets where his eyes had been. Hollow, caved in, like something had already taken them. Birds maybe, or something else. A few small animals had been at him. There were tiny tooth marks on his fingers, and one hand was missing two of them entirely. I froze. My legs just stopped working. My brain couldn't even form words for a few seconds. Then I backed away, slow at first, then faster, until I was far enough to catch my breath and call the police. I gave him my GPS coordinates, thankful my phone still had signal. The woman on the line was calm, told me I'd done the right thing, and asked me to wait there until officers arrived. I hesitated. I didn't want to be anywhere near that body, but I also didn't want to be the guy who stumbled on something like that and just left it alone in the woods. So I went back. I stood a few feet away, not too close, but close enough to keep watch like they'd asked. I didn't sit. I couldn't. The smell was worse the longer you were around it, like it was soaking into my skin. The buzzing of flies didn't stop once. They swarmed in clouds, lifting off the body in waves every time I shifted. I don't know how long I stood there before the sun went down. It was probably about 2 hours before it started getting properly dark. I kept expecting to hear sirens or footsteps or even voices calling my name, but there was nothing. Just the buzzing, the occasional rustle in the trees, and the slow crawl of night. Eventually, I sat down on a flat rock a few feet away. I couldn't see him clearly anymore, just a shape on the ground. That might have been worse in a way. When the light fades, your eyes play tricks on you. At one point, I could have sworn I saw him move, just a twitch of a limb. But it was just my brain messing with me. It had to be. I stayed there until the cops arrived. 4 of them. Their headlights came through the trees before they did, bouncing like ghosts between the trunks. I stood up fast and waved, and one of them called back. When they reached me, they asked questions. How I found him, how long I'd been there, if I touched anything. They didn't ask if I was okay, and I didn't expect them to. They set up a little perimeter, started taking photos. One of them pulled out a tarp and body bag, and I had to look away when they rolled him into it. I remember hearing one of the officers say, "Jesus, poor bastard," and the other one just nodded. They didn't say much else. Later, a detective showed up. She was different. She was quiet, serious, the kind of person who's seen too much already and doesn't have room for shock anymore. She told me they'd identified the man. He was local, mid-30s, reported missing 3 weeks earlier. There was no sign of foul play. He'd left a note in his car parked about a mile away. It was suicide. She didn't go into details, and I didn't ask. After that, they walked me back to my car. I'd parked it on the shoulder of an old access road, not far from the trailhead. The detective told me I could go, and thanked me again for calling in. I drove home in silence. No music, no podcasts. Just the sound of the engine and my thoughts. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Not the face. I never looked directly at his face for long, but the shape of him, the stillness. The smell clung to my clothes, even after a shower. I burned the shirt I was wearing and threw out my boots. I didn't want any of it in the house. A few nights later, the dreams started. They weren't nightmares in the traditional sense. I wasn't running or screaming or being chased. The dreams were quiet, just like that clearing. I'd be standing there, looking at the same spot where I found him, and he'd be lying there. Sometimes he'd sit up, slow like something waking from underwater. Other times he'd just stare at me. No words, no sound, but I could feel something in those dreams, like pressure on my chest, like guilt or shame. Like I wasn't supposed to have found him, like I'd interrupted something important. Eventually, the dream shifted. He wasn't always lying down anymore. He'd stand across from me, just looking. I never saw his face clearly. It was always just out of focus, blurred like a bad photo. And I never said anything. Neither did he. But every time I woke up, I felt sick, tired, like I hadn't slept at all. This went on for months. I didn't tell anyone. Not at first. It felt stupid. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I found a dead guy, and now he shows up in my dreams. People would just think I needed therapy, which maybe I did, but it didn't feel like a trauma thing. It felt different, like the dreams weren't just in my head, like I carried something out of that forest with me. There was one night, I woke up with the smell in my nose again. That same sickly sweet smell. I tore the room apart looking for it. Thought maybe something died in the vents or under the floorboards. But there was nothing. No smell anywhere except in my nose. And the next night, he was in the dream again. I tried everything. Changed my routine. Started sleeping with lights on. Took melatonin. Tried sleeping pills. Drank too much. The dreams didn't stop. Some weeks they were almost every night. Other times they'd skip a while and then come back out of nowhere. The worst part is I started wondering if there was some truth to it, that maybe he really did feel disturbed. Like I'd pulled him from some kind of rest and now he couldn't go back. I hated that thought. It made me afraid to sleep, but even more afraid to be awake. I kept going back to that day over and over in my mind. If I hadn't followed that smell, if I just turned around, he'd still be there. Unfound, rotting quietly in the forest. Alone, but I did find him. I talked about it once, months after it happened, to a guy I knew from work. He was older, ex-military, and he'd seen some things. I didn't give all the details, just told him I found a body and had weird dreams since. He said something that stuck with me. Sometimes when you see death up close, it leaves something behind. Not ghosts or spirits. Just wait, like a shadow that's too big to walk away from. I never forgot that. Eventually, the dreams started to fade. They never fully stopped, but they got less frequent, less intense. I could go weeks, even months without one. Then something small would bring it back. A smell in the woods, a TV show, a certain kind of silence. And that night, I'd be there again, in the clearing, watching. Now, years later, I still think about him sometimes. I looked up his name once, found his obituary. It didn't say much, just a list of names, a short paragraph about his hobbies. No mention of how he died. Most don't include that. But I looked at his face in the photo and didn't recognize it. That was the strangest part. The man in the picture looked kind, smiling, clean cut. He looked like someone you'd see at the grocery store and forget the moment you walked past. But the man I saw in the woods, that shape, that stillness, felt nothing like that. Maybe it really was just my mind trying to make sense of a horrible thing. Maybe the dreams were distress or trauma or guilt. I don't know. All I know is that I still think about him. Not every day, not like before, but enough. I haven't gone off trail since then. I still hike, still get out into the woods when I can, but I stick to the paths now. Something changed that day, not just in how I think about death, but in how I think about being alone. There's something different about being truly alone in the forest, miles from anyone. When I think back to my childhood, there's a part of it I've always pushed off to the side. Something weird and unsettling that happened with my sister. I never told anyone much about it, except for a few close friends who probably thought I was exaggerating or just telling some story to creep them out. But I remember it all clearly, and the older I get, the more I think about it. It wasn't some ghost story. It wasn't demons or anything like that. It was just something that didn't fit. Something that sat sideways in the world, like a puzzle piece that didn't belong in the box it came in. I didn't know how to explain it then, and I still don't now. But I can tell you what happened. My sister and I grew up in the same small house my mom grew up in. It was an older one-story place in a quiet, mostly forgotten part of town. The kind of neighborhood where the houses are close, but you don't really see your neighbors unless they're mowing their lawn or bringing in groceries. The paint on the siding was old and peeling in spots. The windows made this weird, creaking noise in the wind. The floor in the hallway dipped a little if you stepped just right near the coat closet. I remember these things vividly because we didn't move around much. That house had history, not just for my family, but in the bones of it. When my sister was really little, like 3 or 4, she had this imaginary friend named E. That's how she said it. Not E like initials, just E. She would talk about her all the time. My parents just thought it was a kid being a kid. Nothing strange at first. She said E. It was an old lady, really nice, liked to play with her, sit next to her when she colored, things like that. She'd even ask my mom to make a plate for E at dinner sometimes, or talk about what E thought about cartoons. At the time, it was kind of cute. Weird, yeah. The little kid can get creative. I never saw anything, never heard anything. It was all her. Then one day, when she was maybe 4 or 5, the E stuff just stopped. No warning, no goodbye. My sister just stopped talking about her. We were all kind of relieved. We didn't think much of it. The only one who seemed bothered by the silence was my sister. She went kind of quiet for a while after that. Less bubbly. She started sleeping with the door cracked open when before she demanded to be closed all the way. Again, no big deal, just kids being kids. Fast forward a few years. I was maybe 12 or 13, and my sister would have been about 10. At that point, we were sharing a bedroom. 2 twin beds on either side of the room, a small dresser between them, some shelves on the wall with our random junk and books. Our room wasn't big, but it was cozy. We put posters up and string lights that didn't always work right, and we had one of those old digital alarm radios that sat on the dresser. That radio, that's the part one can't shake. It was a Saturday, I remember that clearly. Late afternoon, maybe early evening. My mom had gotten a phone call about our grandpa. He was in the nursing home and had taken a bad turn. She didn't even wait. She grabbed her purse, yelled for my stepdad, and they were out the door in under 5 minutes. That left me and my sister home alone, which wasn't that unusual. We were old enough. I was in the living room, maybe playing a game or watching TV. The house was quiet otherwise. Then I heard the radio in our room turn on. It was that sudden buzz and pop sound that old radios make, followed by static. Then it switched to a station and the volume cranked all the way up. Like all the way up. The speakers were blown out and tinny, and it blasted through the house like someone was trying to wake the dead. I jumped up, thinking my sister was being a brat or trying to scare me. But before I even made it to the hallway, the volume dropped fast, all the way down to nothing. Then back up again like someone was spinning the knob. Then off, dead silent. Then it happened again. I remember just standing there in the hallway, frozen, listening. The third time the radio blared, something in my chest went tight. It wasn't the noise, it was how unnatural it sounded. Not just loud, violent, like someone angry. Then silence again. I burst into our room, already yelling, ready to accuse her of messing around. But the second I stepped in, my words got caught in my throat. She was sitting on her bed, legs pulled up to her chest, pale, staring at the radio. I looked at the radio. It was off. Not even the little red light was on. I crossed the room and yanked the plug out of the wall, just to make a point. Only, there was no plug. I pulled the whole thing off the dresser, flipped it around in my hands. No cord, no batteries in the compartment either. Just empty. The back was dusty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I remember feeling cold then. Not scared, not exactly. Just confused and kind of sick, like the room had lost all the air in it. I looked back at my sister. Her face was blank. Not crying, not talking, just staring. I asked her what happened. She didn't answer right away. Then she looked at me and whispered, "It was E." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I saw her. It was E." I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't even know what it meant. E, it was a name we hadn't heard in years. I hadn't thought about it in forever. It was something from when she was basically a toddler, an imaginary friend she'd made up. But she said it like it was real, like it had just happened. I called my mom, trying not to panic. She answered, and I could tell right away something was wrong. Her voice was raw, shaky. Grandpa had passed away, right around the same time the radio thing happened. I didn't tell her about the radio right then. Didn't have the words. She was already crying. She just told us to stay home, that they'd be back as soon as they could. I held on to that feeling for the rest of the night. That weird buzzing under the skin, like the air around me wasn't sitting right. My sister didn't say much else. She slept with the lights on. I tried to let it go. I really did. Weird stuff happens. Kids say things. Maybe the radio caught some kind of signal surge or something. I didn't know. Maybe it was one of those old wiring things that made the electronics act weird. But then the funeral happened. It was a small service. Just close family. A few relatives I barely recognized showed up. Older cousins, aunts, people from the neighborhood. We were standing around after eating those weird little sandwiches they always have at these things, when this older woman I didn't know came over with a small photo in her hands. She said she'd found it in some of her boxes while going through old family stuff. She thought we might want it. My mom took it and got quiet. Her face sort of dropped. My sister leaned over to look, and she just said, totally calm, "That's E." We all looked at her. She pointed at the woman in the photo. It was an old black and white wedding photo. My grandparents, young and smiling. My grandfather looked about 20. Next to him was a young woman in a long dress. Hair pinned up, delicate features. You could tell she was kind, just from the way she was looking at him. That was our grandmother, my mom's mom. She died when my mom was 11, long before I or my sister were born. We'd never seen any pictures of her before. After she passed, my grandpa eventually remarried. His second wife, my step-grandmother, wasn't a fan of keeping old memories around. She boxed up all of Grandma's things, gave some away, threw out a lot of it. We never had pictures of her in the house growing up. My mom rarely talked about her, but my sister knew that face. She said it again, like she was just remembering something obvious. "That's E." No one said anything. I looked at my mom. Her eyes were glassy, like she was remembering 100 things at once, and none of them were good. We went home later that night, quiet in the car. Everyone had a different look on their face. Mine was confusion. My mom's was grief. My sister's, I don't know. She looked calm, maybe, like a puzzle had finally clicked into place. After that, the radio never turned on again. My sister never talked about E again, not even once. I bring it up every so often, jokingly at first, trying to see if she remembered. She'd just shrug and say she didn't know what I was talking about. But I knew she did. Over the years, I tried to forget it, to explain it away. Static interference. A memory mixed up in a dream. The mind playing tricks, the way grief and fear can warp reality. I even looked up the model of the radio to see if it could hold some residual charge or catch signals without power. Nothing made sense. But here's the thing that stays with me most. We lived in that house for years. All my childhood memories are wrapped up in it. The smells, the creaks, the way the light filtered through the curtains in the evening. I never once felt afraid in that house before that day. Afterward, I never quite felt at ease. I kept thinking about how kids sometimes see things adults don't. Not ghosts or monsters, but things we forget how to notice. People, presences, echoes of something that once was. My sister didn't make EE up. I know that now. She couldn't have. There were no photos, no stories, no way she could have imagined that face and gotten it so exact. She was too little, too honest. I think sometimes maybe EE wasn't there to scare her. Maybe it was just a name a child gave to something familiar. A shape she saw in dreams. A voice that reminded her of comfort. Maybe she really did see our grandmother. Not like in a haunted kind of way. Just something deeper than memory. Something old that lived in the walls of the house where her daughter grew up, where her grandkids now played. After the funeral, my mom put that picture up on the mantle. It's the only photo of our grandmother we ever had.